I have no idea where this will lead us, but I have a definite feeling it will be a place both wonderful and strange.
Hello, and welcome to the Wonderful and Strange Twin Peaks Logcast. I'm Kalil, and with me today is the epilogue book to my limited series.
Your limited series, and I'm the epilogue book. I'm the final notes, the footnotes, a collection of footnotes across many pages. As the Unplugged Professor, I'm honored to be part of your origami material today.
And we're both honored here today to bring you our discussion on the final dossier, the last official inclusion and piece of material from Twin Peaks written by Mark Frost. This is going to be a fairly in-depth breakdown of the book, including spoilers for everything across the entire book, jumping around it. If you haven't finished the book and you want to before listening to this, you should do that right now. Also, heads up for some listeners, there's some content warnings you may want to be aware of. This book and our discussion as follows will talk about things such as self-harm, suicide, and sexual assault. There's some heavy matters in the book, and we need to talk about them as well. Mm-hmm. As far as we can tell, unless there's something in the Conversations with Mark Frost book, we're not 100% sure if it's confirmed when Mark Frost finished writing this book. So we were doing some, preliminary research and trying to find out, well, was this being written while The Return was airing and people were giving their thoughts of what they wanted to see and questions that they had, or was this already done by that point? And the short answer is we're not 100% sure. There's a possibility that this book was being written in response to the fan questions, and that's maybe why it answers things that The Return doesn't. But we're also admitting it's equally possible that these are all things that Mark Frost wanted to address that have nothing to do with the fan response to The Return. All we can really say is that this book was published around 2 months after The Return finished airing. And so it does contain spoilers, obviously, for The Return and answers things and addresses things that The Return didn't. And throughout this whole entire process, we are remembering that Mark Frost has gone on record saying that he got everything he wanted out of writing The Return. So if these things are in the book, I guess they're things he didn't want in The Return.
Yes, for a little bit of a nice aside here, The Secret History of Twin Peaks came out about October 2016, the final dossier October 2017, and we had The Return finish off in about September of 2017. It's one of those cases where a lot of timelines were jumbled around. Ed Victor,
both in the book and outside the book.
Yes, Ed Victor, the literary agent of Mark Frost, is mentioned here, being the last book that he collaborated with him with, and his death was around June of 2017. So we're kind of going all over the place because as far as we're concerned, or at the very least I'm concerned, I'll speak for myself first, in my overall thoughts of Twin Peaks, the final dossier, this book feels very rushed.
Yes.
It gets really clunky at times, and its format for a lot of it is simply kind of like small pieces of things in which maybe someone felt that they wanted to sort of plant down of things that weren't really explained, but not necessarily needed. It was just sort of like, hey, here's a little bit more information.
And our tone about this book, we're both negative on the final dossier. We're going to be probably dunking on it now and then. Our main focus is to actually analyze it and address it. But just a heads up, if you're looking into the book or, maybe a fan of it, the things that I would say are maybe most interesting and valuable is that if you enjoy learning about what happened to the characters after the sake of The Return, and you want to know kind of what their lives are like, this gives you an insight or a peek, if you will, into that. And it also is written in the similar style as with The Secret History with regards to Tammy's point of view. And if you like the Tammy character from The Secret History, this is more of that kind of view. Occasionally it's funny when it's talking about characters like Jerry Horn, so I can see some appeal there, but in most regards, this, for me, personally, is the only Twin Peaks official media I would say is outright bad. I would call this book a mistake.
I think that it's well written, and I think that there's small pieces that I like that I want to put inside my little imaginary mental cabinet and close that in just because I do enjoy small snippets from it, but for a majority of it, it's very much a heavy tell-don't-show sort of fallen with, piece by piece by piece,
right,
organized by character by character by character, to a point that, nothing really gets running or in a nice movement. It feels off.
So for those who haven't read the book or are kind of curious about it, Secret History had a through line where they're in universe. It's Agent TP, later identified as Tammy Preston, going through this dossier to try to find out who wrote this, who is the archivist who put this all together. And along the way, it goes through all these conspiracy theories and elements of history, tying in characters like Dougie Milford into this grand story about UFOs and cover-ups. And it has that kind of drive that you want to read it potentially to uncover more of these mysteries and learn about all the weird connections. This is not really the case for the final dossier. The final dossier, the in-universe explanation, is it's some follow-up reports that Tammy wrote over the course of like 3 days to Gordon Cole, kind of just wrapping things up from the previous report. But a lot of it doesn't really tie in very much to the bigger mysteries of secret history. Most of the beginning of the final dossier is small-town gossip and stuff that only tangentially relates to the case at hand. So in-universe, it doesn't really have that connection. And it's not a dossier like the previous book. It's not going to jump through a bunch of documents. There's a couple points where it'll switch to like Albert's point of view with his words, or it'll give the speech delivered by Hawk from Margaret Lanterman. But a good 85 to 90% of the time, it is just Tammy this time. So I think it loses potentially that unique appeal the previous book had had.
Now that we're talking about the book in general at the moment, there's something that I realized, Kalil, and I hope that you can follow along with me with this.
So.
Because this is something I find a little bit
scrambled.
exciting. Because before we talk about the secret history of Twin Peaks and how we were talking about looking through rose and aqua tinted glasses, right? And you could actually use rose and aqua tinted glasses inside of that as well. One thing that I will note is the absence of the color blue inside this book. There is still red. There's red present. There's like this fun little like Resident Evil Umbrella Corporation sign in the pyramid in a few pages inwards. But every time a rose is present, that is at the beginning and end of the book itself, it is grayed out. What is assumed to be blue rose, like the Blue Rose Task Force, is instead a grayed out rose. As a reminder, Kalil, to me, like if we had anything to read from it, like looking through red and blue, what were red and blue pills in The Matrix? I keep forgetting about the red and blue pills, but also for the audience. We'll pretend this is for the audience, not me.
I hope I'm not making a horrible mistake here, but the red pill was basically to see through the Matrix and see the truth of the situation, and the blue pill was to accept the kind of lie that you've been given.
So basically...
Hence why people say someone's red-pilled on the internet if they see some kind of truth. Political things aside, that's the idea.
Yes. So right now, it seems that the sort of like good, sort of like relaxed, idyllic area of the blue is either absent or slowly is being repaired by the end of the book, I imagine.
I honestly didn't even notice that because there's so few pictures in this book compared to the previous. I did also look at the hardcover book this time. I did not do the audio like I did previously. Did you do the audio this time?
I did both. I did the audio and the physical book.
If we were just to review the products themselves, do you think the hardcover book is about as good as the previous in terms of quality, as far as a piece of memorabilia? Because I know when we talked about the Secret History, you really liked just the physicality of the book and the way in which it was presented. Because this one has less documents, less pictures, do you find it to still be as cool of a collector's item?
Now, mind you, I do think that structurally speaking, not only is it nice just because it has that nice little feel.
I really hope that doesn't pick up on the mic. I just hear some wind gushing and that's it. Whooshing.
But it is... No, don't shoot. Nope.
I love how my response time is so good. Continue.
But no, I think that the strength of the book comes in from a lot of its absences. Like, it's much more sleeker and personal. There are a bunch of triangles on the interior of this, like a half-fitted sleeve onto it, which I personally enjoy. And the beginnings and endings of the books between the text are very nice for the respects of, like, including directly blank pages and also small little, like, simplistic visions of roses and a usage of a lot of geometry when it comes with the triangles. It is striking visually, which I do like. There's a sleekness to this book. Each of the sections are divided by files, which I think that for the feel of the book is very fitting. The only thing that I don't really like, and this is a weird situation, is that they took all the images from like Twin Peaks and made it into a grayscale, which, okay. Why is just Tammy just like keep all the photographs and then
Maybe
implode
that's one of her
them?
hobbies.
She just implodes them to drastic degrees and just plants them onto the page.
Yeah.
That's the only part that
it doesn't quite make sense why they're there. Yeah.
Yes. I think everything else with the seriousness of it fits very well other than those. So, yeah, I would say physically, as a book, as you're a fan of Twin Peaks, if you like
Looks good on your shelf.
it looks good on your shelf.
How's the audiobook?
The audiobook has only one actress, a talented actress.
So the parts where it's Albert writing or it's Hawk giving a speech, those are still Tammy?
Those are still Tammy. It
Oh,
is just
wow.
Tammy throughout the entire audiobook.
Okay. Huh. Yeah, that's definitely interesting as a choice. I mean, I wonder if those voice actors weren't available anymore, because I know for sure Hawk, he had contributed the voice. Michael Horse had.
I don't want to get too far into it, but like there's points inside of this, especially with like a far lessened cast in the future. And I'm wondering if either A, the budget was just much less in the final dossier, or B, there might have been a book deal situation where they could only do so much that they put all the eggs in the
And
secret
that's one of those
history
possibilities we don't know about, is maybe that this was part of a 2-book deal with the publisher. We don't know all the situations of why this book exists. I would just say for some of the reasons we're touching upon and more, this doesn't feel like as much of a finished product. It feels like there were some ideas on the table and sort of a quick execution on those ideas that maybe this could have been developed into a fuller picture. For me, I was missing a story. I was missing some kind of guiding, insightful angle to be really drawn into the world. Instead, this book ended up feeling a bit to me like, you know, when you're watching a movie and they have those occasional scenes where they'll show pictures of someone and say what happened to them after the movie ended. Like, this person went on to go do this. It feels like that as a whole book.
Yeah.
And what's kind of unfortunate as a result of that is that once you take away the information from the book, there's very little reason to go back to it. And what I mean by that is, if you want to know, for example, what happened to Leo Johnson at the end of season 2, The Return did not answer it, but you still want to know, you can find out reading the final dossier. Or, now that the book's already been released, you can go on the Twin Peaks wiki, look at Leo's page, and it'll be there for you. Anything that's major in this book has already been documented on fan sites like the Twin Peaks wiki, and that's really most of it already there.
If you come out with something that's just basically information and in its text-based format, it doesn't survive as much as the missing pieces just because of how many things sort of get dabbled into there. It's, as you said, like things in this internet age can be taken from this, and then you are left with basically nothing remaining
Because
in the
this
book.
book doesn't have a lot of stylistic flourishes to really make it compelling on its own.
No.
Secret History, I think, did, because of the different archival elements, and especially by the physical edition, the different things coming in through the different visuals on the page. This is something where even when Tammy's going through something, it'll often summarize a person's entire life in like a page or two, and it's just info. There's occasionally moments where she'll remark, and this is where, for me at least, Tammy started to feel less like Tammy and more like a voice for Mark Frost, more like a mouthpiece for Mark Frost. And that was something that I thought was also a bit harder for me to get into as I tried to understand what character Tammy was. Because just like, get this out of the way, this does not in any way feel like Tammy from The Return.
No, I think that as far as Tammy is concerned for The Return, and it's something that I kind of predicted inside of myself, like going back into the book, I don't think that Tammy was going to be the same person, mostly because there was hardly a person in The Return. I think that the largest fault that comes into Tammy Preston in the book and the book preceding is mostly at fault for how little we got inside The Return.
Yeah, it's one of those situations where I can't imagine any of the lines that Tammy says in this book being said by Tammy in the show. And that's not a knock against Krista Bell as an actor. It's a knock against the fact that The Return doesn't really give her much of a personality. So I can't even imagine what if she did sound like this. They're not compatible. And also, it's one of those things where, to me, the mark of good fan fiction is that the author is able to channel the characters in a way that's believable, so that when I'm reading it, I don't question, oh, this is a different author. I'm thinking, oh yeah, this is the same character that from the show. Really good fan fiction can make it seamless, that they act in character. This is a bit of a problem, I think, when Mark Frost, the co-creator of Twin Peaks, is writing Tammy, a character in The Return, and it doesn't feel like her. And that's not all on Mark Frost, I don't think.
No, I think that there is a way, in fact, to play with this. I think that it's just dealing not only with the genre, but the specific character. On you are going through the final notes and pieces of things. It's very hard to make a character that could be, say, for example, written off as humorous for the amount of dissonance in their like stylings and characteristics of someone who might be more soft-spoken and then gets into this strange literate rut. Like someone that goes from to like Kenny from South Park is going, and the echelon we're seeing as something much larger. There's a potential avenue. With her, though, not so much.
Yeah, like with Dougie in Secret History, it could be funny because the Dougie we got in the show was just this random old man who died one night having sex with Lana Milford, and that's it. But then they made him into this giant secret agent, international conspiracy man in the bunker with Nixon looking at the aliens. That's funny. Yep. That's a funny change. With Tammy, she goes from being nothing on the return to being an actual character, and it's not a funny kind of dissonance. It's just a dissonance, at least for me.
Mm-hmm. Same thing here, for us.
And you and I were talking about this, and I think you had a good idea that if we wanted to kind of make the return more interesting, maybe kind of mitigate some of these concerns about Tammy, one way to do that would have been to introduce more narrative voices more consistently throughout the book. Not necessarily the voice acting literally, but literally having different perspectives.
Yes, because we do have a small little blurb from Albert Rosenfeld inside the book that talks about a point where, like, Tammy Preston could not be present. So it's like Albert, who was experienced and present around there, writes, I believe, the first chapter and goes into detail onto that. What made me crave more, thanks to something like The Secret History of Twin Peaks, why not go for those differing perspectives and see where you could lean into that, so it has that sort of like fun little give and take and narrative weight. A lot of this book and a lot of the items that are incorrect and are excused for are mostly due to the almost like rush sense of like having to get in to get this information, but also for the reasons of trying to get out. If this was more of a rush job situation, or if they needed to get as much information as possible, instead of just having one archivist, bring in the full Blue Rose task force. We have a past member who was physically in the town, which could be Albert Rosenfeld. Hells, I'll even like bring in Gordon Cole for someone who might want an emotional link to Dale Cooper and explore these personal relationships. And then Tammy Preston could be more on the job, in which she is focusing in on the small pieces that just aren't fitting thanks to the things she's experienced. She's got the stuff after all.
It would make the book more interesting. It would make the book more dynamic. It would also make it so you have different perspectives coming in so that we wouldn't get parts that potentially feel out of character for Tammy. One thing that kept bothering me, for example, with Tammy, and even a little bit with, I guess, Albert dissonance, is how they respond to events that are supernatural. Because it feels to me like Tammy, after seeing what she saw at the end of part 17, she shouldn't be that skeptical after seeing the Bob Blob, after being around when the Vortex was there with Gordon Cole, seeing what happened with Bill Hastings' head being caved in with no one around to do it. She shouldn't be as skeptical as she sometimes is in this book. It just doesn't mesh with me. Whereas if we were jumping between perspectives, it would allow for people to kind of like counteract and counterbalance and have different viewpoints potentially on these matters.
And I think the more damnable part, you could argue that it's just because of like how her mind is shifting as time is going on. But she goes through both odds and ends of, hey, this is not scientifically right, to also, hey, from what I've seen so far, like, this could be completely a possible category. You can't undunk an Oreo. After the Oreo has been placed in the milk, you can't undunk that.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And one thing also that the book teases at the very end is the idea hinted at with Jeffries with the official timeline. Gordon will remember the official timeline. We get something that might be like that. We get the idea that the timeline of the old Twin Peaks is being forgotten by people and the new one's being preserved. And what I'm getting at is that with all the secret history discrepancies, there's ideas that maybe there's multiple timelines, and that's why people's names are different or timelines are different. With this book, there is something already being done with timelines. We wish it was more, because if Tammy's the main character, and if we're going to keep Tammy as the main one, and she's having to deal with all of the things she just saw at the end of part 17, which would overwhelm anyone to see those kind of things happening in front of your eyes, especially if you're like someone who's lived your whole life more skeptical, and now you're faced with this unimaginable weird truth. And then on top of it, timelines are being shifted so that people aren't remembering the same things. That's perfect ground for an unreliable narrator.
I do genuinely feel that. I understand that this is a year after everything that has gone through, but the enticement of like carrying a weight forward is very nice for a character that I wish could be going through. I wish that we could have gone through something such as more of a Lovecraftian feel if we had to have a single narrator for the most part and leading into, as
then
you
have
were
that
saying,
narrator
unreliable.
be dynamic. Have like, as we're reading the book, we see the decomposing of her constitution in kind of like a breakdown of her reasoning. She's having trouble understanding what she saw.
And ending on a point where she has to cut her research short to travel away because she's noticing like timelines are now like not making sense anymore. Like these people are saying this is how they're behaving, and she's realizing her own memory is starting to go. She's becoming more conscious of her own deterioration that she has to go. That's compelling.
That is already more interesting than what's happening right now in the book. And I think that those are ideas that aren't incongruous with what's already being done with Twin Peaks. It's, to me, a logical follow-up, potentially. Because look at what happened to Jeffries when he got so deep into the supernatural. It does have an effect on these people, these agents. So having Tammy, she's a new Blue Rose agent. She's not experienced with these things. What does that do to someone to start looking into these matters like in Part 17 and 18?
And I think that with Jeffries, like dunking him in the middle of his story with him popping in, seeing Cooper inside a fire walk with me, and falling into that. If we saw him in more reserved and more agent in his ways of moving and speaking, that would not be as effective as someone who's just realized he teleported throughout the vast cosmos, comes over here, sees someone who could be a visual threat and be like, excuse me. The panic, the uneasiness, that is just compelling that I can't see it in a different fashion.
And I brought up the idea of fan fiction a moment ago because when I read the final dossier, it doesn't feel to me like this is the official what happened with Twin Peaks. To me, it feels like this is an author's variation. This is a take. This is a way to view it. It doesn't feel canon in my head, which is interesting because I've considered less official sounding things headcanon. This to me starts to feel like an author's attempt at explaining some of the things. And when I'm talking about fan fiction, I will admit, if this was written by just a regular, ordinary fan, I probably would be a bit more positive on it and more glowing for the impressiveness of that feat as a way of showing one's dedicated love for a series. But when it is a co-creator of the series like Mark Frost, I will admit I hold that to a higher standard. When it is a published official work with hardcover print and all that, I do hold it higher than I would a fan creation. I'm going to hold it a little bit harsher than I would.
So basically you're viewing it as like a collection of tweets, but more so in a fancy format.
Sure.
Like from the author being like, yeah, this is happening.
I guess I consider it more official than that. I mean, really. but I would say that when I'm reading David Lynch or Twin Peaks inspired fiction from books like Outside In Walks with Fire or In Heaven Everything Is Fine, I'm more allowing for the idea that these are other authors and other viewpoints. They're not officially the creators. There is a bit of a difference in my mind into that. And another thing, too, is that with this book, it's hard for me to buy into the fiction because it's one thing to have the FBI diving into the dossier. And in Secret History, most of what was in that book made sense to be part of this case. There was some stuff, like with Ed and Norma and how they met, where I'm like, I don't know if this relates to UFOs. It feels a little bit tangential. Yeah. Why is Hank's final letter from prison in here? I don't know. But I will say that most of Secret History felt like it made sense for the FBI to look into. It was really hard for me to suspend my disbelief and buy into the reason in-universe that Tammy would spend at least half this book diving into small-town gossip and relationship updates. Like, why would she care what happened to Donna years later? That wasn't even part of her research before.
It's part of being a thorough archivist.
And every time that Tammy would interrupt, it felt like it was Mark Frost at times interrupting. It's hard for me to tell the difference between Tammy's character and just a guise for Mark Frost to write under to give his thoughts on situations. So like one example of this is that Tammy is talking about Dale Cooper, and she says that he has a white knight syndrome. He has an irresistible urge to rescue every damsel in distress, and he has to help birds with broken wings. And she blatantly implies that part of her blames Dale Cooper for what happened to Annie Blackburn. It's interesting to me because at this point, Tammy only knows Cooper from a few reports, and then she had the briefest of encounters with him in Part 17. But most of what she knows about him isn't even him, it's the Doppelcooper, it's Mr. C. She barely knows anything about this guy, yet is making these sweeping conclusions, and it feels like it's Mark Frost telling his opinion about Dale Cooper, to me more than Tammy. I guess my question for you then, Professor, when she describes him as having the white knight syndrome, has to help the damsels, has to help the birds with a broken wing, and that he's to blame partly for Annie, is this how you see Dale Cooper?
I believe that we've had discussions multiple times on like how Dale Cooper is that angel, that guardian angel, that white knight in the situation. So nothing that I've really have a point to contest against.
But for anyone who's kind of jumping into this episode, maybe not as familiar with those discussions we've had in the past, Do you generally agree with Tammy's assessment?
I do genuinely agree with Tammy's assessment. I do find that Dale Cooper is just trying his best to do something right, and that is to his own folly at times.
Mm-hmm. Do you think Tammy would have enough to make that conclusion?
Do I think Tammy would have enough to that conclusion? I think that that's going to be a problem we're going to have a lot of times over with any of this.
So we're in agreement on that, though.
Yes.
I think we're in agreement more about this than almost any other piece of Twin Peaks media.
Mm-hmm.
We're united.
We're united
not
together.
Since episode 16 of season 2, when we complained about that episode together.
It's been years, Kalil. It's good to have you on my side.
It's been 87 years. Titanic gif. Speaking of time changing and turning boats into rust under the water, while talking about the town changing, Tammy writes, quote, "The trials and trivialities of daily life, I've concluded, act on the mind as a kind of local anesthetic, numbing us to the relentless passage and ravages of time." And she calls that a kind of mercy. Do you think that in real life, that is how it works, where we get so distracted by the day in and day out of things that we're thankfully unaware of how quickly time is passing and changing things?
I think the most effective way is that if we are unaware of the time passing, that we're unaware of having to reflect upon it. I think that unawareness and that sort of bliss is an idea played with throughout Twin Peaks that, sure, one could reflexively look back and be thankful, but I don't think anyone, at the very least, if we take the characters from Twin Peaks, very few would look at it that way. Like, but also...
So you believe in real life, yes, but in Twin Peaks, no?
I believe in real life, it can happen plenty times more than the people in Twin Peaks. I think a lot of people are doomed from the perspectives we've seen.
In Twin Peaks?
Yes.
So just to clarify, people in Twin Peaks don't see it that way because they choose not to? Or what do you mean? Could you elaborate?
I do not believe the introspection of ignorance is found in many characters, mostly because I feel that many of the motivations we find with characters in Twin Peaks are thanks to that ignorance. I feel that this sort of like bliss and this unawarity happens, but more so people aren't looking at it that way, except for Tammy Preston in this book and maybe a few, I would say, grab bag examples, such as Dr. Jacoby maybe might say something like this, or maybe Dale Cooper might say something like this.
But you think they're wrong about the world they live in?
I think that they are very wrong about the world that they live in. I think that being wrong about the world that you live in is something that we were very adamant against, say, for example, with Dr. Hayward. And
This is very interesting to me because I'm curious. So you think that most people, rather than benefiting from the distraction of their daily circumstances from the ravages of time, what are you saying is really going on?
It makes a perpetual cycle of that pain for a lot of these people. I think that the bliss that they get in the very short term is outdone by the long-term harm that we see from characters time and time again.
So it's not working as an anesthetic?
No.
Do you think they are aware of the ravages of time then?
I think that they have other things to blame other than the ravages of time, but in a larger scale, they are blaming time itself. It's like in that broad scape, where you blame like the hours your manager gives you, but it's more so thanks to the company saying that this is the way that it has to be. They're focusing in on these like smaller portions and trying to move on to the next thing.
I'm not sure if I agree or disagree. I'm actually kind of on the fence because when I think of Twin Peaks characters and I think of the idea here, I think that the town of Twin Peaks is often portrayed as not changing very much. And a lot of the ideas in Twin Peaks media involve recursion, that people continue passing down the traits and dispositions of their forefathers in various ways. And the Bookhouse Boys will always fight the darkness. And this family is always going to be a group of criminals like the Renaults. And it's always going to keep looping this sort of endless way. And in that sense, nothing changes. And the Twin Peaks we see in The Return, there are people who seem stuck in the past in a way that seems like they aren't, again, moving forward. It's kind of like this sort of continuousness, which almost flies counter to the quote then, that if they are truly being ravaged by time and things are actually, when you take a step back, totally changing in ways they don't realize, I'm not even sure if I realize it looking from the show, because it seems like, if anything, they're stuck in a recurring nightmare, and their day-to-day circumstances, rather than numbing them from it, I think kind of what you're getting at is that they are a lot of times the most tortuous aspect. Because think about someone like Ed, right? Do his day-to-day circumstances throughout the original show and in between The Return, when he's with an unhappy marriage, when he's just kind of in a dull existence, staring out at his reflection in a window at night, are those distracting him from the bigger pain of, oh no, time is changing? I think it's almost the fact that nothing's changing. I think that's almost the bigger horror, is that he can go 30 years and still not be with the woman he loves.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost the fact that time is not changing enough. Is that what you're kind of getting at?
I'm kind of getting into it.
This is interesting. I'm just not sure how I feel about it. Because at first I just took Tammy's words and I'm like, oh, yes, it is true. Because I'm relating to it to real life, where it's like, I know so many people that are in our age demographic of like 20s and 30s who will be like, whoa, I just realized this thing I grew up with is now 20 years old, right? Like, we're approaching the anniversary of this thing. Or like, this video game Undertale came out like 10 years ago. Oh my God.
Yes.
And just sudden realizations of how time passes, especially when you're in your 20s and 30s, when it still feels like high school maybe wasn't that long ago, but you're like, oh wow, it's half my life ago.
Mm-hmm.
Those sort of things can start to pop up throughout. But in Twin Peaks, do those realizations happen very often?
It's a weird sort of case-by-case basis, but I don't think the case happens that often. I think the biggest part about this, and I think it throws the ball more into your court on the respects that Tammy Preston could be more so of an author insert, where the author might be trying to relate with the person beyond, where they can nod and say yes. But I don't think that's the case in Twin Peaks.
I don't think it's an accurate assessment of Twin Peaks as a town and the people in it, especially the ones she's covering, because she does spend an awful lot of time between the two books on the Norma, Ed, and Nadine situation.
Yep.
So that's interesting, because my follow-up question was going to be, what do we do with this, right? If we look at the idea that the day-to-day trivialities are a distraction that thankfully prevents us from realizing how much time is passing. If we take that to be the core of what she's saying, well, what do we do with that then? Should we purposefully try to just live in the moment and ignore the passages of time to spare ourselves from that deep existential dread? Or do we try to look at the big picture, confront our rapidly passing time, and then possibly get swept away in that and miss the day-to-day? What is the takeaway to how to live better from what Tammy's saying?
The hard part is that thanks to the return, or at the very least with some rare exceptions, and many events that we see along the way, a lot of it is nullified by the sense that both of these can be right and wrong answers. It is very heavily case by case. We see a situation where just trying to do these things eventually becomes a reward for Ed and Norma, but becomes a sort of bad ending, as we've talked about for Agent Dale Cooper and the like, where the goods and the bads can start to fly all over the place, even in this book on its own. Like, I think that Annie was not a character that was ever just trying to live things passively, and she was more confrontational at the very least. But her ending is not at all good.
Well, and there's this idea, I think it was in Margaret's speech, about passengers versus travelers.
Yes.
And the idea, I think, being that you want to be a more active participant, a more aware, a more searching, and more adventurous sort of person. I think that's generally a good thing. But then the people who seem to do that a lot, like Dale Cooper and Philip Jeffries, nothing good happens to them.
Nope.
Major Briggs, I would call more a traveler than a visitor or a passenger.
Mm-hmm.
And his adventuring did not go well either. So I look at these cases where it's like, I don't know, it seems like if you try really hard to uncover the truths of the world, your soul gets annihilated. Or you end up decapitated in space. And then if you don't try to seek out those bigger pictures and you just quietly accept the mundanity of your life, you just quietly suffer for the rest of your days and not able to achieve your dreams.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is where maybe you could argue that Twin Peaks, the truth ends up being somewhere in the middle. That the people who are able to find balance between those things are the ones that end up doing the best. People like maybe Bobby, who can find some sort of balance between those things, making some changes to improve his life, but also understanding and accepting the quietude of his normality as well. Mm-hmm. That ultimately the greatest goods that he can do are to help his family, not try to save the world. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's where the good lies. Is that what Tammy's getting at, or Mark Frost? I don't know, but it's what I'm getting at. It's what I'm thinking after I read this. And that, I think, is maybe where this book also shines, is that it can provide interesting food for thought. And I hope that as we're continuing to talk about this book, a book that neither of us really particularly like, I hope we can find interesting things to jump off from with it. That it is compelling in that way.
We want to put the salt on the saltines. We do not want this to be unsalted.
I actually like unsalted saltines quite a bit.
You have the wrong opinion.
That is, yeah, I can see it. I can see myself being wrong there. That's fair. I worry sometimes I have too much salt in my diet, you know? Like I was looking at those tortillas, those carb balance ones I've been eating, not sponsored, and they got like 22% of your amount of salt in one tortilla, and I'm like, dude, it's great you have fiber in you, but like that's so much salt for one tortilla.
This is where you're getting the bad ending for realizing and taking action for yourself, and I'm getting the good ending of being passive, not caring, stuffing the saltines in my mouth.
Just eating gratuitous amounts of bad food.
They're called saltines for a reason. An unsalted saltine, what is bad? It's an ein.
It's an ein. So the Twin Peaks book ends with Tammy waxing poetic. This is another instance where it kind of felt to me like it was the author's viewpoint, potentially. Tammy feels like she's just laying out the themes of Twin Peaks, or at least a way of viewing Twin Peaks. So she talks about how fear and wonder are two sides of the same coin. That fear and wonder are two sides of the same coin, and quote, what if the truth lies just beyond the limits of our fear, and the only way to reach it is to never look away? What if that's why we must keep going, why we can never quit trying to overcome it in every moment we're alive? Begging these kind of questions that largely end the whole book, and then by proxy, unless something else comes out later, end Twin Peaks officially. Mm-hmm. What do you think of the ending of Twin Peaks and this book being Tammy urging you to never quit and try to overcome?
It seems like a strange sense of begging questions that don't really have much links to anything else, and putting things forward at a hopeful note that it's one of those cases where I look at, I'll consider Tammy Preston a friend in this moment.
Okay.
It's where a friend comes forward to you after like all this horrible stuff has happened and says, it's going to be A-okay. It didn't put a Band-Aid on, Tammy. I'm sorry.
It doesn't fix the systems in place that allowed these systems to perpetuate, and it doesn't help the fact that there are supernatural demons that are trying to rip people's faces off.
I appreciate the kindness, but as far as the text inside of Twin Peaks goes and how literal these pieces can be, it is something where there is a lot more that we have to work on other than just sort of be hopeful. It's good to keep an eye out and kind of look forward and not ignore the fears that you have, but there's also something larger behind those fears that demand more than the individual. It demands a group.
I think the feeling I get from it is that I generally agree with the sentiment. I think it's good advice to a point, but also it feels a little bit basic and trivial in light of everything. Like all of the Twin Peaks media spanning over like 25 years, and the whole entire message we dilute this in at the end is don't give up, feels a little bit trite when we're looking at generational cycles of trauma and all of these bigger societal issues that allow these things to happen. Because the characters who oftentimes I view as being able to look past the fear, so to speak, I think of a character like Margaret Lanterman, I think of a character like Major Briggs, and they are able to do a fair amount of good in the time that they have, but I also think even then there's complications, because Margaret Lanterman was not able to save Laura Palmer. And Margaret Lanterman sounds like she lived in fear most of her life after a horrible incident happened to her that she was unable to prevent with her husband. And she has basically spent the majority of her life alone and afraid. And like, she's wise and she has great wisdom at the end. But I also wonder, like, was that a happy life? Was that fulfilling? And then Major Briggs was doing great with the whole idea of seeing Bobby and him on that vast veranda on the estate. And then he got his head cut off by a bunch of woodsmen, and now he floats around saying blue rose in the sky.
I think the biggest problem that I have, Kalil, forgive me for being the biggest broken record to ever be.
Just like the one that was in Leland Palmer's house during the Maddie Missoula, Montana scene.
You saw my cameo. It's beautiful.
It's beautiful.
The biggest problem we have is that this is coming from Tammy Preston. This is very much a rallying cry at the end of a great war from a character whose struggles are very barren and, though lightly touched upon in this media, are not done. If Tammy Preston says this is something where both of us are very critical on. However, I could imagine a realm where we're less critical on it and are able to focus in more on like the specifics or like the direction of it if it was given with a character who has gone through the fight a bit more. And
even Albert.
Albert or Margaret Lanterman, I know that she has a speech inside of this, that when you have someone more reputable that has been through that pain and has been on that battlefield raising the sword, if you will, then I feel more compelled by that.
They lived through it.
They lived through it.
They haven't just read about it.
Exactly. She's been on the sidelines for the most part, and she's just starting to experience it. Valuable information, but not something to end like
The
a
whole
final
thing
note on.
And maybe you could argue we're reading too much into it, but it is the ending note of Twin Peaks.
Mm-hmm.
It is the ending note of this book. So I would say like it's fairly important how you end a story. And I think when you look at The Return, Part 18's ending, it is not providing hope and closure. It is ripping open closure and providing dread, if you asked me. But it's because it's ambiguous, because you don't really know what is happening, what is exactly going on that causes the scream, what year is it? You have the idea of the whisper that happens. We still don't know what Laura said to Dale Cooper in that red room. There's all these elements that do not compel me to believe in a generic message of perseverance. It feels like there's something eating away at me deeper than that. You mentioned Margaret Lanterman's speech. I have to bring this one up. I genuinely misread this. I thought when I was reading it, this was Hawke's speech that he came up with on his own after kind of like spending time talking to Margaret in The Return. He gathered his thoughts together, gathered her wisdom and with his own insight, because he's always been a very insightful guy whenever Cooper asked him questions about things. And Hawke wrote his speech and he presented it. Normally he's a quiet guy, but once he got up there, he really said some beautiful things that he learned from Margaret.
This is not the case.
It turns out I'm wrong. I misread it. Hawke does give the speech.
Yes, but it was a note left behind by Margaret Lanterman.
Yeah, it's Margaret's. Which, don't get me wrong, it is still a good speech. I think it still makes sense for Margaret to read it, but it would have been more powerful to me if Hawke had learned lessons from her and it was his variation on the speech.
Like something he would say that what he'd imagined Margaret would have said. It would have kind of joined into, if we think Lynch Frost, this sort of Margaret Hawke, but create that sort of sense of unity with those characters and also what they've experienced and what legacy that leaves beyond. I think that that's just genuinely more powerful than having one final note tidbit after we had so many moments where she is very much literally dying and giving these phone calls.
All you would have had to do to make this work, and I think it would have been very doable, is move the Hawke Margaret Lanterman speech to the end of the book. Like, you could still have Tammy do a little thing before that, but have it end with the speech of Margaret Lanterman's final words in that note to Hawke, ending Twin Peaks. Isn't that more poetic? Isn't that more beautiful? Like, I just think, like, Margaret Lanterman's words ending it through the voice of Hawke, continuing the legacy. He's going to carry on the log. He's going to become sheriff. Confirmed. We'll get to that later.
We'll get to that.
But it would have made more sense than ending it with Tammy, and it would have, I think, been more resonant to end it with Margaret's words.
Margaret's words being spoken through from Hawke is a preference, but yes, Margaret's words is still a nice way to end
it. And it feels like they're very similar messages as well, so you could easily just have it be at the end instead of Tammy's.
Something along the lines of, while I'm on my plane flying back, my mind is only anchored by these final words that I discovered on my journey.
Because then it shows Tammy's agreeing with those words, but it's from someone else, not coming from her.
And she's using it potentially as a means of support, as if like she gained something from the journey that she's carrying forward.
And this is also where you can tie in your idea. If she was more haunted by the realizations, haunted by the slipping away memories, this could be a grounding for her.
Yeah, the light at the end of the dark.
And isn't that better? Look, I'm just saying, we got some ideas here, you know what I'm saying? If you want to make a late-minute change, release the book again, we got you covered here. Those are free. Well, actually, I'd like a little bit of a royalty here, but,
You can give all the royalties.
You can send your requests for publication and editorial services to Snake Eye Dreams 1, that's a numeral 1, on Twitter. As in, one time I messed up this order and it's near the end of our podcast. Or you can Gmail them to us at
Gmail
at Snake Eye Dreams.
We're ending the podcast soon, so Kalil may have more time for this.
I figured there's two ways we can go. We can end the podcast fine-tuning and perfecting our formula, or deconstructing it and ruining it. And it seems like that's more in the spirit of what we're about, is just flubbing it at the end. And maybe that's what Twin Peaks is about, based on this book.
Aw.
That was my sick burn of the day.
Yeah, it is. It burnt me.
So, hey, you know what? I gotta say, if you're feeling burned out by that, there's some words from Margaret Lanterman. She said, quote, "No one is helpless. No one is beyond helping. It is good to seek out those who need us and do what we can for them." End quote. Good advice. Immediately, I wanted to apply it to Twin Peaks. And I think the obvious thing is to look at characters like Laura, Bobby, Becky, Steven, young people who were going through tough things. We see how Bobby and Becky have support from their fathers, both of them, and that seems to help them get through what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
As a quick aside, we find out that Becky is like working at the Double R now and seems to be doing better, for example.
Yeah. Good for her.
Whereas characters like Laura and Steven do not have that support from their families. At least Steven, we can guess. We don't know all of his details, but it seems like that's not going well. He has no support system.
Wait, Steven was the person married
Burnett.
to Becky.
Yes.
Well, it's not going well for him because he killed himself. I guess
what I meant to say is yeah, you're right. I'm more mean.
Not on the up and up at the moment.
I'm more
going
mean.
down and down the dirt.
Yeah, I more meant that we don't know if he had a support system in the past. I don't mean now,
okay,
presently.
Fair.
Again, it tells you I'm flubbing it at the end here. But what my brain went going to is the less obvious cases, like would it have been possible to help Leo Johnson? Like, well, by the time we see him in season 1 of Twin Peaks, by the time we see him in the pilot, when he's drinking straight cream de menthe and yelling at his wife, what kind of support would need to happen to reach out to Leo Johnson to help him if no one's beyond helping?
For the most part, like, the hardest part about this question is, like, a lot of Twin Peaks on aid and assistance comes from people that could be considered family or those who are close. There's
institutions do not seem reliable.
Institutions aren't reliable. It's more so of the people that you have around you and how they may influence you. And for the most part, a lot of the poor influences, say, for example, with Leo Johnson, he keeps company that is supportive for him, but not for all great reasons.
His closest friend is probably Jacques Renault,
which is big into that drug ring that seems to be a good little hobby that they're keeping together. Now, mind you, the other hard point to this is that we technically get, though there's still a lot of regret and still failures on his part onto it, but he's constantly still working through these things, the reformed Benjamin Horne.
Mm-hmm.
He is someone that, thanks to a series of not only wild events, but also things very personal to him, that he is trying to take more of a spiritual journey for himself.
And I think the way that the books frame it, because they take the timeline that Audrey was protesting him when she got not attacked, but when she was in the bomb explosion at the bank, that she was protesting him, it seems as though that was very resonant, that she basically sacrificed herself to stop what he was doing. And then as he watched what happened afterward with the Ghostwood prison, it seems like he came to a gradual realization that his daughter was right. He was wrong. She paid the ultimate price. He has to live with that guilt now of what happened.
It takes more than carrots.
And then also the stuff with the Hayward family we'll get to momentarily. It feels like he didn't have a person who was like older than him guiding him, but it seemed like he had support through kind of introspection, that he was able to look at the efforts made by his daughter retroactively and maybe notice those things and maybe learn those lessons. If you want to credit John Justice Wheeler, I guess you could throw a carrot his way too.
But regardless, it's showing kind of still in that sense of like relationships, but more so in the absence of, through someone such as Benjamin Horne, who is the probably most reformed person we have in the entire text of it. Would any of these other characters experience that? It's very much, for one, a case-by-case basis, but number two, the cases don't look great.
And you mentioning Horne here, I do have to bring up Richard Horne.
Yes.
He's another young person who very much seems troubled, and if we're taking the idea that no one is beyond helping, I think he's the ultimate case. Can Richard Horne, well, he's dead now, but could he have been reformed? Could anyone have helped him? Because like we know from the book that Audrey did not allow her father, Ben Horne, to see Richard or be part of his life.
Yes.
Ben was a more positive influence potentially by that point as a reformed man as he got older. But would Ben have been able to do anything to help sway Richard away from becoming a drug trafficker, away from his aggression and violence? Would the support of Ben have been a positive influence enough? I think that's highly debatable.
I think it's heavily debatable.
I think Ben struggled with himself, let alone anyone else.
Yes, especially with his assistant, I would say that he's
still going
find
through
those struggles.
Right. And knowing he has to know his assistant has a husband who is dying at home. Like, has a husband who's dying.
And if, say, for example, Richard was more inside of his life, would he have gone through much of this arc as well if he was able to make enough excuses otherwise?
I guess the question is, was Richard born evil?
Was
he born with original sin from Bob?
Richard was born with every disadvantage you could think of, born into a situation where it might be harder for, and it's not to say that single parents don't do their best or do wonderful things. I myself grew under a single parent for some time due to the loss of my father. It's something, though, that is very difficult to keep track of, even just a kid, let alone multiple kids, whatever the scenario is, especially if you're full-time working and just trying to make everything work for them. It's hard. To have someone in which that connection could be made, that the way that he exists is thanks to something that could be traumatic for Audrey, that she might not want to talk about the husband that she may or may not know about. The picture is a curious thing of Dale Cooper. But also for the people that he seems to be in circles with, at the very least by the end of his journeys on how he was introduced to them. He is at every single hurdle fallen over to the point that he's now breaking the hurdles to get by.
I think Richard Horne might be one of the most interesting characters to take aside and try to fill in all the gaps that aren't given to you by the book in The Return, because the moment you start speculating on these things, the more pictures start to form, because based on how Audrey was when she was young, and knowing that she was a mother not that long after, she would have started raising Richard when she was in her early 20s at that point, when he was starting to get older. She didn't have really strong structure. She was someone who was always more mischievous and more kind of against the rules on things. Would she be a solid foundation while she's also running her own business and seems to be in a marriage that isn't very active or familial or supportive? I'm looking at Richard probably living in a very permissive household, most likely having a lot of freedom to get into things without supervision, without a lot of help. This is all my guessing because we don't know for sure. But that's the picture that starts to form when I think of young Audrey Horne raising a child without really any support while she's also trying to do her business. I think that Richard can get lost through the cracks there. And combine that with the influx of these worse drugs that are coming in that Bobby talked about during The Return, talk about the different influences that can happen there. I think you start to get this element of a story of a real tragic character. But then I'm also torn in a totally different direction because he literally is the son of a demon. Like the mythological supernatural angle comes in too, where it's like, was Richard literally born evil in the sense that his father was Mr. C/Bob?
It's the classic nurture versus nature situation. I always lean heavily towards nurture, but I do understand that
this is supernature, though. This is supernatural. This is if your genes are demonic. This is a bit different. Because I normally lean as well on the nurture
demonic.
Side. Half demonic on my father's side. But no, I mean, like, it's a problem, right? Like, it is a problem.
There's so many problems here, though. It's in the problem basket. Yeah. And the problem basket is even leaking.
And this is where I'm torn, because if I ask, is Richard Horne a successful character? I'm like, I think he's really interesting to speculate about, and he's fun, but that's also a lot of the legwork and just general theory crafting being done by the fans.
Yep.
What does the show actually give us? It gives us a man who just runs over children and doesn't seem to have any conscience about it.
Yep.
And seems to have no positive trait whatsoever. Is he human? Is Richard Horne even human? I'm not sure about. So it's just hard for me to know. And that's where the fan fiction element comes into play with this kind of book, is that I agree this could be how Audrey Horne lived her life, and this could be how Richard Horne came to be. But I don't know if I'm 100% convinced. I don't know. Mm-hmm. I'm given answers, but are they the answers? Is sort of a recurring thought I have with this book, right?
Which of the checklist do you want to order on your hypothetical burger sheet? I don't know. How much of the canon do you take?
Right? And that's totally up to you, listener. Totally up to you. Any way you
beef
want
patty,
it.
onion,
That's the
peanut
patty
butter.
you eat. Anyway, back to Margaret Lanterman's speech. I think we were talking about that at one point. She kind of has these big ideas ending the note that Hawk reads off about how anyone who's ever spent a night alone in the woods will come to realize and learn that light always returns at the end, which I think is a really apt way of comparing it as someone who grew up right around the woods and not really, well, I guess grew up around it too, but also someone who literally lived there and kind of experienced the woods more than most Twin Peaks residents. Mm-hmm. And she says, quote, through the letter, "When a dark age comes, hold the light inside. That's where it lives anyway." And then ends with, quote, "This truth I know as sure as the dawn. Darkness will always yield to light when the light is strong." Sick rhyme game from LL, the log lady.
Absolutely. When you walk away, you don't hear me say, please, no, baby, don't go.
Do you think the light won at the end of the return?
The hardest part about this is how far you want to go into light and dark. I do feel more compelled by the log lady as I am about to say this. It is something where I do look at it, and it seems like a speech that is supposed to try to help free the spirit during points of turmoil. And to have that at like your funeral is more than fitting. Mind you, though, with Twin Peaks, there are points of darkness that, like, darkness also will come back yet again, and then light comes around. It's a cycle thing that, sure, it can say that, like, light wins at the end, but it's more so like everyone has their turn on the Ferris wheel.
If it's a cycle, it's equal. It is equally true to say that light always wins in the end, as it is to say darkness always wins in the end, because there is no end.
And the hardest part is that in the text of Twin Peaks, we have beings that literally feed off of people's suffering. Now, whenever it comes to suffering, usually the higher highs lead to the larger falls. Who's to say that that darkness can't even just sort of like play around with things to a point that, say, for example, throw a win here and get more reward there for themselves?
See, I really like this speech, because I think that there are things we can poke at it, but I think it's actually adding depth rather than removing it.
Yes.
I think that there are flaws and alternative ways to view it, but even in doing that, it expands the material a bit. Because, when I asked you the question, does the light win at the end of Parteen? I'm obviously referring to how the light literally shuts off in the Palmer house, Laura's screaming, everything goes to dark, it's awful. But if we take Margaret's words, that isn't the end. That is the last thing we see of Twin Peaks, and of the show at least. And the idea that there is that darkness now, but there will be light. And that is a consistent thing through all of Twin Peaks, that it always ebbs and flows. Season 2 ended with a lot of darkness, but moments of light still peeked through. And you even have Fire Walk With Me, all of the horrible things Laura went through, she still has the angels in the end. So there is this idea that even if the last thing we see is dark, we have to kind of go on faith that the light will continue. Because again, anyone who's ever been out in the forest at night knows that the sun will come up. And I like that. But again, it's like recognizing that counterbalance, because I can hear Wyndham Earle, right, approach and say, like, this is the musings of a senile old woman. Does she not realize that the darkness is always what returns, to swallow up the light every chance you get, holding on to these false hopes? Oh, I hope my true love will be with me. In the end, we are all alone and servants of chaos. I feel like he would just rise up in that moment. And he wouldn't be totally wrong, because in Twin Peaks, anything you think is going to be great has a great chance of falling.
The mighty maw of darkness will lick upon your sweet supple lollipop. And
Please
though
do
the
not
maw-
talk about anyone's supple lollipop, Professor.
And though the mouth may leave, it shall return again for yet another taste.
Okay, well, I think we're both agreeing right now,
Yep.
is this idea that it's equally true that while you can view it as a sign of hope that that goodness always follows, there's also a very sobering reality that if it's always a cycle of these things, you can't ever be too happy or grateful, because it always is going to come crashing down. Like, you have to always kind of live with the acknowledgement that it will fade. The goodness will go. Nothing is eternally positive. And I think through that it's painful and it's scary, but I do think you can still look at that and say you have to work past that fear. And that's where fear comes into that, right? Fear being the mind killer, of course. And you have to be able to look at it like Major Briggs, I think, did, and Margaret Lanterman did, and be able to look past that fear and recognize that there is fear in letting go. There is dread in the idea that everything will go away. But if it's always gone positive in the past, to live on with that sort of belief and faith that nothing is ever eternally bad, and to still hold on and find peace within that balance and ebb and flow. I think there's a power in that. What complicates things further, though, is the exact kinds of darkness that are in Twin Peaks, because there are two main categories of this. One of them involves, like, demons that appear to try to end the world potentially and carve like sculptures in people's faces and eat their Garmonbozia suffering.
As you do.
And I think we do need to do something about that. Like, I do think we can't just sit by and say, it'll pass. Like, I do think we have to actively try to fight that. We cannot be too at peace with that.
The Dogpas will go one day. Just give them their space. They need to learn their lessons.
Like, you can't totally destroy them, but, like, I think it's important that in the return, they didn't just allow Mr. C to go visit the Palmer house. That might have been bad.
It's okay. The light is at the end of the tunnel.
Right. So on one hand, you can't be too passive
Yeah.
about that. But then there's also the really grounded stuff of Twin Peaks that you also can't just be too passive. Like, yes, suffering in general will all exist. But should we do things in society to try to prevent people from ruining their entire lives to drug and alcohol abuse? Yeah, we should try to provide, like, help to people who are suffering addiction. We should try to do measures that could prevent that from happening in the future. And I know we all disagree about what those might look like, but I think we should agree that if something's a harmful substance that's like tearing people's lives apart, we shouldn't just sit by and do nothing. And even the Bookhouse boys, ineffectual as they are, have this idea you have to fight the darkness. You can't just make peace with it. So it can't be passive. And again, to get really dark and honest about Twin Peaks, what happened to Laura Palmer has to be at the center of these conversations again. This is a case of rape and incest.
Yep.
So this is something that, yes, it's darkness, but you can't just quietly accept, oh man, sexual assault will always happen. I guess we got to just deal with that. Like, no, like obviously not. You have to continue to do things to fight that. And I think the good thing about Twin Peaks is that it's not like Major Briggs ever stopped fighting. He was able to see past the fear that love was not enough, but still fight for that love, and that meant doing active things in the world, not shutting yourself away to live in like a convent away from the pain and suffering. See, there's so much you could do with the convent thing with Annie that could have been interesting. I think you could do things with that.
You could have done
the idea of someone shutting themselves away from the pain to get away from it, but you can't do that. That doesn't help yourself or anyone else necessarily. Maybe temporarily you can do that, but I don't know. I don't know,
Short-terms
man.
versus long terms.
It's a very chewy, like, speech and idea that I think could have been a really cool bookend for all of Twin Peaks, because it opens up all of these complicated conversations we're having right now. Speaking of complicated conversations,
Oh boy.
Dr. Will Hayward and Benjamin Horne had a complicated conversation at the end of season 2. As we remember it happening, Ben had showed up to confront Dr. Hayward and Donna about the true identity of Donna's father, biologically being himself, Ben Horne, not Dr. Hayward. Dr. Hayward, angry about the family being torn apart, grabs Ben and shoves him into the fireplace mantle. Don't worry about that. Official records state that Ben was there to talk about Audrey and her condition at the hospital.
Yep.
And then he just slipped.
He slipped
And there
onto
were no witnesses. Donna wasn't there. Eileen wasn't there. It's fine.
It's just Dr. Hayward
Sylvia
who was
Horne-
responsible for the...
Sylvia Horne was not at the door?
No.
No, it was just Ben and Dr.
Just
Hayward.
Ben and Dr. Hayward in the same spot. And don't worry, Dr. Hayward also took care of things after this event.
Yeah, he took care of the paperwork just to make sure everything's the way it should be.
And made sure that, like, Ben got to Hasbell and at first was being seen by...
This is such a fun section to read as someone who's been an anti-Dr. Hayward guy. You know, we've had jokes about chainsaw hands and all that sort of stuff. But Dr. Hayward, I always kind of was like, I don't know. I get he's supposed to be like a cool dad to Donna and be very supportive. But then other things with the autopsy scene, I'm like, you just want to cover up the truth all the time. And you don't want people to actually see the things that are going on. So the fact that, like, he literally falsified medical documents, that seems a bit, as the kids say, sus.
He didn't... I imagine that there's just a certain degree of, number one, he didn't want, like, more information of his daughter to get out. Number two, if there was any trouble that could have been caused by not only information from his daughter being involved with a potential man whose criminal record, if it exploded, could also see into trouble for her own well-being and finances, that could be horrible. So trying to distance them, that was a number of issues right there. Number three, making sure that if there's as few witnesses as possible, that if there was an accusation to fall down on, Dr. Hayward would be the one to take the shot, and he could try to limit other people being caught up in that shot just because of how much suspicion would then be onto him. It seems like he is trying his best to fall into almost a potential end of martyrdom if anything goes awry, to the point that he is willing to bury all this. But it's also that constant flaw we have with him, as you were saying before, where, like, he wants to keep everything.
He wants to keep burying. As Donna said, why can't they bury you deep enough, Laura? Father wants to bury everything deep enough. There's something to be said of that. I just kind of realized as you were talking too, if we're looking at the idea of Twin Peaks media of returning family heritages,
yes.
I think the Hayward example is very interesting because this is an example of a stable family with presumably a stable history from what I think I remember of what we heard of the Haywards, turning into a disruptive cycle. Because this is where that horrible incident shatters the Hayward family. Harriet does great. She goes off to college. She becomes a pediatrician near Seattle. # good for her. Really excited that Harriet's doing well. Happy for her. Genuinely the happiest character in all of Twin Peaks, Harriet Hayward.
And just as a note right here, is Harriet the eldest or a middle child?
Middle, who likes to write poetry.
Okay, so
we saw her just in the pilot.
Yeah, we just saw exactly. Like he couldn't bury them deep enough in the hole of Twin Peaks.
No, she climbed out and went to college, and I'm happy for her.
But no, we have Donna, who is likely like moving out soon enough anyway from high school. Then we had this other sister,
Gersten.
No, well, we're getting to Gersten.
Oh.
Harriet
you're talking
was
about
also moving out. Gersten, though, we are getting to now,
Yes.
the youngest, who had to probably experience this new dynamic, which, by the way, the dynamic is the doc moves away.
Well, because Harriet was still, like, in, I want to say, early high school or late middle school when the divorce would have happened. She still had a few years with the family. She
still had a few years, but who had the most and then probably had no one thanks to one person in college and one person in New York. Gersten left behind amongst like this new dynamic because Dr. Hayward moves off and divorces from the family. There's some money coming in for Eileen Hayward where she is starting to get funds thanks to Benjamin Horne, likely Benjamin Horne, who felt probably guilty, I'm imagining, from a lot of things, ends up financially supporting them. I think it was like $7,500 a month.
Which is not a small amount to receive as some sort of child support for children that are not biologically yours.
Yeah, no.
He's supporting Dr. Hayward's children at that point, not Donna.
Mm-hmm. So another like little penny inside of the hat that says things have changed for Benjamin Horne.
But you could argue, counter-argument though,
Counter-argument.
if he's doing it out of total guilt to try to make up for it, that doesn't necessarily mean he's had a total change of character. He just feels bad, so here's some charity.
Yeah.
I personally don't think it that way. I do think it's a sign of good that he's owning up to it. Because the old Benjamin Horne that I know from season 1 and 2, or at least most of season 2, he would not have ever done that. He would never have helped in that way at all.
And some of it still exists because it's in some respects that when it's out of his own control with what happened to Richard Horne that invaded this other home, and he says that he can't keep sending her money, and then referring to his past wife, or are they currently married?
They divorced.
Sylvia. Sylvia. The fact that Sylvia Horne is asking for money for what had happened, and Benjamin Horne is willing to put his foot down for that, but separately on this other end, he is giving money to this other family.
That is actually a good point, yeah.
Yeah.
This is where part of me wonders, is that an interesting dynamic, or is that a difference between the return in this book?
I'm going to stick to interesting dynamic because it makes me feel good.
It makes you feel like a much more complicated character, whereas it's just a writing problem. I like your thinking too. I just have to acknowledge the other side of it as well.
I get you.
I just think it's interesting that in all these cases of generational like continuances, the Hayward family might be one of the only examples of a family that came from generally good standings and just completely ruptured. And I don't think it's enough to say, oh, it's the Horne influence here, because a lot of the problems here extend past Donna. Yes, Donna biologically is a Horne, but Gersten isn't. So I don't think it's enough to say, oh, it's actually that the Horne curse or whatever. No, I don't think so. I think that this is an example that you can break the cycle, good or bad. You can have a healthy family and then introduce enough disruption. Now, here's the question I would have. Is the bigger problem that broke the family apart because Ben told the truth to Donna in front of all the family members? Is that what ruined the family? Or is it Dr. Hayward's response?
It's one of those cases where I put a lot of the response, though in kindness it likely was, from Dr. Hayward as a heavy motivator, but also a lot of what spun out of control, for one, was thanks to Ben. It's one of those little column A, column B fun situations where I can't give you a singular answer. I have to say it's a molding, if you will, of just perfect things happening at perfect times. It's just perfect's not positive. And
I blame Dr. Hayward.
You can blame Dr. Hayward by all means, but I will say, for the respects of Dr. Hayward and what kindnesses he tries to put forward, he was a great influence for Donna. And in the script of the show, Donna is only really influenced externally thanks to her trying to use that good nature to follow Laura Palmer and thusly also fall into some of those cracks.
I think the reason I would blame Dr. Hayward stems mostly from the fact that Donna wanted to know and was 18. So it's one thing that, Benny respected Dr. Hayward's wish to keep this, secret, and Eileen's wish to keep this secret. But then Donna became 18, turned into an adult, and Donna was seeking the information out. Not like Ben was going out of his way to show it. So I think what ended up happening was that Ben saw that Donna wanted to know, and it was one of those situations he was not going to lie. He was put in a really hard spot where Donna was straight up asking him information, wanting to know the truth. So I don't think he's wrong to tell her. I think that at a certain point, even before she's an adult, I think she had the right to know. But especially when she's an adult and asking, I think she has the right to know who her biological father is. Dr. Hayward's response is assault. Dr. Hayward's response is, let's go take this man, the father of my child, and go bat his head into a fireplace mantle.
And it all worked out.
It all worked out great. I don't know. This is where, I don't think the book is blaming Dr. Hayward. I don't think Tammy is blaming Dr. Hayward. I am.
I
I'm
understand.
looking at the situation and I'm like, this was the really, really wrong response to your daughter wanting to know the truth of her family.
It is a very bad timing, and it's a very bad response that I did. But I also have to recognize that in an absent area where gas is present, it is thanks to gas and the sparked flame that causes the combustion.
The gas was deceit.
The gas was deceit, and
That's
Dr.
Hayward.
Hayward is deceit. But still, regardless, the spark that blew everything apart was thanks to Ben coming around. If Ben didn't come around, he could probably circumvent it for more times and move things around and may make an uneasy foundation.
Again,
but
Ben
I do
did not
think
go out of his
nearly
way.
killing a man in a fireplace, which I do put onto Dr. Hayward's hands.
I would hope you do. His
do.
chainsaw hands.
It still was a problem from there. And you could also say that past Ben, who didn't follow up with this, could also be a bit of a problem because he was very absent throughout.
Well, that's
Donna's
also
time.
what Eileen and Dr. Hayward wanted.
Yes.
The reason why there was gas in the first place is because it was not being checked. This shouldn't have built up to this point. And I blame the Haywards for not telling Donna the truth when she was asking questions. Again, Ben was not going out of his way to go seek out Donna and tell her every single moment that he could.
Yes.
Donna was seeking him out. What was he supposed to do? Is he supposed to just lie to her face and pretend when she's a grown adult?
That's the Hayward way.
That's the Hayward way. So I blame the gas and the spark on the Haywards. Both. I don't blame Ben for much of anything at all in this situation.
Fair.
Which is remarkable because the man's to blame for a lot of things. Ben did a lot of bad things during Twin Peaks. He hurt a lot of people. He did a lot of damage to his own family with Sylvia Horn and Johnny and Audrey.
It's
but
just
I don't think he's to blame for the Hayward problems.
It's a question of whether or not he's actually doing a kindness out of this, though. Just imagine it from the implications of whether or not Ben is good or bad at that point in time. What could be considered as a good thing from him is morally coming up with his relationship with them and trying to be honest, living an honest life. Sometimes, people feel that honesty is the best policy. However, it could also come from a more marketed sense of Benjamin Horne, who's trying to sell himself as an honest man. If he becomes more open with things such as a daughter he didn't have to tend to, but also is open about that relationship, but also it becomes a soft blow thanks to the relation and the high standards that the Haywards are already put on by the town, it could have been a soft cushion of him just trying to be showing good Ben more.
But this also gets further complicated by how the show portrays the Ghostwood scenario as Ben clearly on the surface being against the Ghostwood operation, but then Secret History and Final Dossier strongly say that Ben was secretly actually having nefarious plans. That's not in the show. That's in the books.
Yep.
And if I go by show Ben and I take him at his word, he was really trying to change at that time. If I go by the books, it was a marketing gimmick. And this is where that even enters the play about what he's doing with other situations unrelated to Ghostwood. It enters all these things. And then once we get through the falsified medical documents, Ben and Dr. Hayward both keep quiet about the situation. 3 months after that, Dr. Hayward retires from his medical practice, divorces his wife Eileen, and moves to Vermont.
Yep.
It's not ever stated if he gave child support for Gersten and Harriet. We know that Ben did. It's not stated if Dr. Hayward did.
Yep.
Which I think is interesting that wasn't stated. Why do you think Dr. Hayward took such drastic measures to 3 months later remove himself entirely from the situation?
I think, as I was mentioning before, it's so that if anything ends up following up, he can try to take more of a martyred area. He's the one who's causing a lot of the lies. He's the one keeping a lot of secrecy. And the biggest aspect is him doing this with Ben. He's got so many hands onto this that if anything goes down, he's probably going to be aimed at. So in order to try to likely save face or save his family in a way that he believes in,
sure,
he's probably moving and distancing. So yeah, if someone calls up or follows, that's going to cause like him to be able to take the hit. But it also, by a counterpoint, might have affected Gersten and likely Eileen by extent.
It's one thing if the marriage was getting strained, that's understandable given the circumstances, and they had to divorce, that's one thing. But the fact that he also moved out of town and completely had to upend his life, that's what makes me curious, because it made him absent during Gersten and Harriet's childhoods.
Yep.
Now, Harriet, we already said, was very successful in her own right.
Yes.
Moved on to do okay.
Yes.
Donna seems to be the one that's a bit in the middle, where she definitely had her struggles, but also doesn't seem as wayward as Gersten we'll get to later. So Donna moves to New York City, becomes a model, one of the fresh faces of the 90s, as Tammy puts it. And by the time she was in her late 20s, she'd already married a man that was about almost 2 decades older. So my question for you is, when you think of Donna from the end of season 2, that character, do you think New York City model marrying someone almost twice her age? Does that feel like a logical progression of the character? What are your feelings on that as a fan fiction idea, if you want to think of it that way?
It's one of those cases that maybe she could have spoken to them and realized that there was not much ground she could cover beyond, and she goes off to do something else.
I think the modeling thing came out of nowhere, in my opinion.
The hardest part is I think anything could have came out of almost nowhere. I'm saying almost because there's something later on.
Yeah.
That thanks to her just being mostly a reflection or just a piece to react to other characters, what is Donna outside of James and Laura?
A model.
Apparently
a New York City model.
But beyond that is just innocent and can be probably drug around all over the place. And there is an innocence that is captured by her modeling.
Speaking of drug around, that's the other thing that Donna happens to be interested in.
Yes.
Which, you can tie to Laura. You can tie back to Laura as well.
With the bar in Canada.
Yes. But Donna ends up having some issues with drug and alcohol abuse and dependence. She enters rehab. At first, it was because she was voluntarily doing it, but then it sounds like for the 4 stints that followed over the 5 years, that it became less of a voluntary thing she had to do. A particularly bad incident occurred after her mother, Eileen, died from heart failure, and basically Donna disappeared and was found 2 days later in a crack house. Donna's husband divorced her, not even really important enough character to really go into much there, and she basically was left with less money, fighting this addiction. So approaching 40, she returns to, well, not Twin Peaks, but to Vermont to be with her father, to kind of reunite. First time, really, that they've spoken in like 20 years. And she continues to be with him while he's like 70 years old. And she is going to be trying to get a degree as a nurse practitioner, while also sponsoring the local 12-step program. So you end with this note of potential positivity that she's taking these lived experiences that she's gone through and trying to help other people, and is on the path of recovery. And yet again, another example of like the healing bond of family potentially, where reuniting with her father seemed to have a very positive influence on her.
Yes.
Do you like the story of Donna in this book? Ignoring for a matter whether or not it fits Donna, because you already said that Donna's amorphous. But do you like the story? When
Donna's amorphous, and I've only got so little things on how she's impacted, and it's very much sort of like a note after note after note. Yeah, no, I'm stuck in indifference. It's one of those
because if
cases...
this was a character you never met before, which basically Donna at this point is.
Yes.
Because modeling Donna's not a character I know. So it's the new character we're introduced to. Oh, some sad things happen, and then they end up okay.
Yep.
Neat.
I mean, the closest tie you can give is like taking up nursing, which is in the medical field similar to her father, but that's a very thin line.
At least what would have helped this book if it was more in the secret history style would have been having something where we read from Donna's point of view, or read from even Dr. Hayward's point of view. Something where it puts us in the character perspectives to give us a break from Tammy's like anecdotes. Because it feels like right now it's just information, tell. the most we can maybe do to show it would be to give us a little bit of a break. And what is Donna saying and thinking? Maybe it's a letter that Donna wrote. Maybe it's a letter that Donna wrote to her father to reunite. Maybe we get to see that note. I don't know why Tammy would have it, but who knows why she has any of this stuff.
Pardon me as I pick up my wiffle bat to beat this to death over here, but the only example of like giving a break was right at the beginning. Just imagine walking into work.
Oh,
like,
there was Hawk with Margaret Lanterman.
There's Hawk with Margaret Lanterman, but that was still being led by Tammy Preston. Like, it basically she's re-noting a note that was written, if you will. She's archiving. But
yeah,
regardless,
seeing something from Donna would have helped. It would have made it feel like it was something, you know, it would have made it feel more real.
Fair.
And I think we could both agree that Donna's story does not belong in The Return.
I don't think so, but also I don't know what necessarily belongs or doesn't belong in Return, just because
as long as it happens slowly.
There's an experimentation with the different tones, locations, and spaces. So
yeah, I think the show can jump around. So it's already in New York anyway. It could jump to that situation. It could jump to Vermont. Maybe Donna showed up in the Skype call. There's ways you could have shoehorned Donna in, but I do think it'd be shoehorning because I don't think her story connects to much of anything.
I don't think so.
But I also felt like Dr. Hayward's Skype call felt kind of out of nowhere at the time. And doesn't really feel like it's in place in that scene.
Fun little cameo.
The best part about that for me was seeing the desk Skype set up.
Everyone's impressed by the desk. In the behind the scenes, people were impressed by the desk.
It's a really cool desk.
It's a really cool desk.
And then last is Gersten, who at the beginning of things looks like she's doing great. She's got a great setup here. She's a musical prodigy. She performed piano solos in concerts across the Northwest while still in her early teens. Mm-hmm. She took college-level math courses as a high school freshman, and she was able to speak and read in 4 languages. That's many more things than I've ever been able to do. Very impressive.
Good
She
job.
also tested well above genius IQ and graduated from high school at age 16.
Yes.
Now, it pleases me to note that there's another character in this book who similarly gets glowing reviews about their intelligence, and that is the character who's most similar to Gersten Hayward, Wyndham Earle. Wyndham Earle was described in this book as a gifted child prodigy, a chess grandmaster by 14, in university at 16, graduated university at 18, and then he completed his FBI training with historically high remarks. Now, for comparing the two, graduating high school at 16 and then in university at 16 line up actually really nicely.
Yes.
So it seems like they're both on a pretty good trajectory to be, if we were to have like a great showdown between them, let's face it, Gersten Hayward and Wyndham Earle, the two most intelligent characters in Twin Peaks, they are the ones most apt for a battle of wits.
Very much so. I imagine dreaming of it, seeing all that sweet, sweet Gersten poetry content and being like, you know who also likes poetry?
Well, Harriet's the one who likes poetry, but that's okay.
They're the same sister.
No, they're really not.
They are
really
practically
not.
the same.
Do you remember Gersten for the original show?
Yeah, that was the piano.
Yeah, she was wearing like the pink.
Yeah, I just thought they were the same person.
No, they're different ages
Nope.
entirely.
Okay,
They're
well.
like separated by like a long time.
Look at me with pie on my face as I go ahead and just try to navigate this one person that doesn't get many scenes, dialogue, or instances.
No, neither of them do. Neither of them do. Harriet's in like one scene. Gersten might be in 2, maybe. but like the thing is, I think it's really silly and kind of funny how unintentionally lined up these two get, because Wyndham Earle's section begins very similar to Gersten's, where they both have like establishing their childhood prodigy nature. And it's kind of funny because in no other way do these two obviously have any connection. It feels like a little bit of overkill maybe on Gersten, because Wyndham we know was, sharp as a diamond or whatever nonsense Cooper said in the show. He had to be this like top-notch FBI guy. I get why you're setting him up to an extent. But Gersten, having her like know 4 languages and being over above genius IQ, I don't know what that does for her character.
I think
she doesn't have to be that. That's okay if she is, but
it does less, I would say, for like traditionally character. I think that there's some fun navigation, and what it does more is for her tragedy. She
becomes the tragedy of the gifted student.
Yes.
The gifted student from an unstable family background, not prepared for the real world. I get it. I just think when we look at The Return, do you get her genius IQ passed from her actions in the return?
Yes, because she's able to navigate her love interest away from his wife when she comes in with a gun and shoots the door. She knows when exactly to hide into the staircase. Otherwise, why wouldn't they just leave the building? No, she knew the very instant she would come out. She did like some super like Doctor Strange style extra magical math and was just like, yes, at exactly 3:22, we've got to go downstairs and just stand in the stairway. She'll never see it coming. So yes, I did, in fact. Thank you very much.
I think of 2:53 is the number, not 3 o'clock, whatever you say.
He's rounded up.
Number of completion.
Number
of completion. I just think it'd be funny if the book would have gone on to give many more characters the same kind of backstory. Like, speaking of Dick Tremaine, did you know that when he was in 3rd grade, he was able to do quantum physics? Did you know also that Eileen Hayward was able to build a bridge? She completely blueprinted the design of a bridge. It's one of the best bridges ever now.
Did you know that Toad was on the football team? Wait, no, that's already there.
Toad was the football team. No one else was on the team. He was so smart. He figured how to win games on his own. Should have developed that with every character. Anyway, Gersten, she becomes like this, again, sort of archetypal idea of the gifted student who doesn't know how to adjust to the world and has family issues. And they start to show up with nervous collapses, emotional breakdowns. And it's just described in the book as being from childhood trauma and the demands of the adult world. It's not really elaborated on in a way that means much to me. Like, it just kind of feels like, oh yeah, she had emotional problems. And we're just left to the implication of, I guess her family stuff was tough. But we don't really know the details of like what triggered all these things later, and just that it happened when she couldn't face adult world some reason.
It's something where like we get to explore where the highs are, but we're kind of missing that sort of like narrative
to make
arc.
It personal, to make it feel real. Like, I'm not saying it can't happen. Of course it can happen.
It can happen, certainly.
When you just give me the basic bare bones of it, though, it doesn't really paint a picture or anything like that.
Stepped away from Gersten, where like the largest descriptors are just towards those highs.
And again, all this time I'm thinking, why is Tammy writing about this? Why does Tammy care about this? This is not related to UFO investigations or the FBI. Anyway, so later on...
Gotta investigate that weird hole in Twin Peaks.
Later on, Gersten goes to live with Twin Peaks. Live with Twin Peaks?
Yep.
Live in Twin Peaks with her mother. After doctors prescribed her a steady dose and steady course of antidepressants, she later turned to street drugs. Clearly that was not enough for her. Then her mother died. Gersten entered a relationship with Steven, and he's given a little bit of a blurb about being a low-level drug dealer and her source of narcotics. Kind of similar, obviously, with how Laura got drugs from Bobby. I guess you could draw a parallel there. And by the end of things, still missing are Steven, Gersten, and Richard Horn. Obviously, Steven and Richard Horn are not about to be found anytime too soon.
Nope.
I'm surprised Steven's body wasn't recovered, but maybe the white moose took care of that in the woods. Bringing the white moose back.
Bring the white moose to become Gersten, a janitor of the forest.
A year later, where's Gersten? What do you think?
She probably got either A, lost in the woods, B, she wandered into something that she shouldn't have.
Bigfoot.
C, she decided, screw this, I'm just gonna restart everything, and then she started a whole new life. She's no longer Gersten, she's Stanger, and she lives in Oklahoma with a family of 4. With her loving wife.
How'd she get the 4? Wait, the 4 including herself and the wife, or is that including... So 2 others.
2 others.
Where'd she acquire them?
Nuclear family.
Okay.
She is the nuclear family.
So that's pretty ominous with part 8 in mind. No, I listened to all this, and it's just like, I have no idea where she is. She could be dead. She could have assumed a new identity. Either way, like, I guess it's fine. I don't have any investment in this character. Gersten, to me, feels like a really failed concept, just from my experience, because yeah, it was like a very small moment. There's no series. Blink and you miss it kind of character, just barely in the show, very forgettable. And then she's in the return, but the only way you would know it's her is if you miraculously recognize the actor who over 25 years went from being like a 9-year-old to being an adult, or you're looking at the credits and you happen to see that it says Gersten. In no place in the show does anyone like say Gersten, as far as I can remember.
Nope.
So you have to really be paying attention for the return to even notice who that is. And then in the book, it's explained, and I'm just like, okay, cool. Okay, I get it. I intellectually get it, but I don't really care. What has happened with this character to make me interested? And I don't really understand my emotional investment in the storyline.
Mm-hmm. There's none.
I don't have anything to say about it. Like, nothing wrong with the actor. I think she did a fine job as Kirsten as an adult. It was half-baked. Like, I would need a lot more content with her to understand her perspective and to have some attachment to her.
She was someone that you can look at and be like, oh, really? That's Kirsten.
I feel more about Harriet Hayward having her happy ending than anything with Kirsten.
Poor Kirsten.
Because I'll be honest, I remember the moment with Harriet with that poem where she's talking about maybe it is the full blossom of the evening. I remember that more than I remember any of the Gersten stuff in The Return.
People keep falling through the cracks because of people like you, Kalil. People like you that just say, oh, well, you're not interesting enough.
Guess what? I have a giant broom that I'm going to slowly sweep up, and I'm going to push all those Return characters into that hole. You were at the Roadhouse on which night? Let me get your name here. Your name's Glendis? Who's Glendis? And then I sweep you into there. Chloanne? I'm sorry, you're going in there.
Chloanne?
Yeah. It's like Chloe and Anne.
I was just thinking it's like a weird mutation of Klonoa.
Oh, like the game?
Yeah, there's no other thing than Klonoa. What else is it, a disease?
Sounds like a disease, doesn't it? Anyway, speaking of maybe a disease, I don't know if this is a good segue or not. Audrey's going through some things in The Return, and we get answers, kind of, about her in the final dossier.
Okay.
More things where it's like, if David Lynch wanted this in The Return, why wasn't it kind of things? Why wasn't more established? It felt like in The Return, Audrey was very mysterious on purpose. But this book does lay some things out while also obfuscating others. So it says that after 3.5 weeks with her coma, Audrey woke up. And so that right away, I think, would be pretty strong evidence to disprove a theory that I was seeing around the fan community at the time, that Audrey in The Return might still be in that coma from all those years ago. But it seems like not the case.
No. Does not seem to be the case at this time.
If you take the book to be, canon.
Mm-hmm.
And also, before leaving town, Dr. Hayward saw Cooper in his FBI suit and everything, leaving Audrey's ICU room while Audrey was in a coma. And I'm guessing he didn't think too much of it because he knew that Cooper knew Audrey, but also Cooper should have been under more surveillance and care given what happened last time.
Yep.
But also, considering when he got shot, he very quickly wanted to leave the hospital and went back to duty at the beginning of season 2. This wouldn't be the first time that Dale Cooper left without proper medical clearance.
Yep.
So I think he kind of was just like, well, he should be under care, but also it's Dale Cooper. So Dale Cooper leaves the ICU, and obviously this is very alarming. And in case you weren't figuring out and connecting the dots already, the book, and Tammy by association does spell it out, that after about 9 months later, from this exact moment, Audrey has a child named Richard Horn. Now, where this gets kind of curious, I guess, is that we find out that Audrey keeps this picture of Cooper in this salon that she owns in her office. And she seems to not question who the father is. She never says it's Dale Cooper, but the picture seems kind of suspicious. And she's not inquiring anything about it.
Yeah.
It's unclear if she has any conscious knowledge about the fact that Dale Cooper sexually assaulted her while she was in a coma. If she's in a coma, she shouldn't be aware of that.
If she's in a coma, she shouldn't be aware from that. But also, number one, there is the issue of what she might be able to recognize through Richard. Number
Maybe.
2, and something that she could try to put together herself. Number 2, the way that Twin Peaks tends to work out is there's a bit of mystical that can also be involved. If you wanted to make something out of pain and suffering, and if I could say Bob could potentially visit your dreams in that respect, I wouldn't put it entirely out of the camp. So we're kind of at this little precipice, I suppose, where it's like the spiritual form of understanding where you just know internally, which isn't too far from what is seen from Twin Peaks.
Intuition,
if you will. Or if it's a mythical sense of understanding where it's just something where Bob wanted them to know or something dark wanted them to know in order to create more of that suffering in existence. To say that that couldn't be something that could be done, we don't see it really, but if they said that it happened, I wouldn't be surprised.
Right. There is an elephant in the room, though. and the elephant in the room is named John Justice Wheeler. He is an adventurous elephant who owns a plane, and likes to go on adventures, and is conspicuously missing from the book. And I say that because I wasn't, too surprised when John Justice Wheeler wasn't in the return. I get it. It's fine. But the thing is that this book tends to talk about characters that were in season 2. We get stuff with Vivian. We get stuff with Evelyn Marsh. We get stuff with Annie. And so when you get all these season 2 characters kind of being mentioned, at least, it's interesting that John Justice Wheeler is not even paid that lip service. When last time we saw Audrey in season 2, she was still in love with the guy and had just slept with him like the day before the bank explosion incident. So it is very possible, theoretically, if she's pregnant and has this child, it lines up perfectly to be John Justice Wheeler's kid. And she was still in love with him. So my question is, why do we not see any evidence that she was still in love with John Justice Wheeler or thought he might be the father?
Hypothetically speaking, you could say that somehow, there's just no information of this event because only Pete saw them together. So why would anyone else know about the John Justice Wheeler sleeping in the plane situation? That's one argument. The other argument is to avoid any distractions from it, to be more clear and just sort of state it out there, especially after Cooper's dialogue saying, goodbye, son. That, yes,
it just makes Audrey's reactions really hard for me to gauge because the Audrey that's described in this book doesn't feel like the Audrey I know. Hashtag not my Audrey. But the problem with this is that Audrey is such a hard to pinpoint character in general. We know that she was very much interested in Dale Cooper, but by the time we reached the end of season 2, she had largely accepted that Cooper was not going to be with her, that he had these oaths he was willing to protect, and she would know that that's not going to happen. And instead, she was very much smitten by John Justice Wheeler. For her to move on from that so quickly and put up the picture of Cooper and just kind of not ask any questions, it almost feels like it needs a supernatural explanation for me to fully gauge. Also, strangely on that note, is what she ends up doing with regards to the child. She refuses any help financially from her mother and her father, and I can understand maybe that's stubbornness, why she'd want to do it herself. But she writes this letter to her mom saying that, quote, she was preparing for the most important role of her life, raising her child as a single mother. And I just find that wording to be rather curious because the Audrey I have in my mind from season 2 and season 1 was someone who was very adventurous, someone who was drawn to people who'd seen these great things and been to these great places. She was someone who was on the cusp of graduating high school and being out on her own and wanting to do things on her own. I think that the sudden appearance of this child, I'd be curious on Audrey's tone of suddenly having her life kind of derailed by having a child, that she wasn't able to go do these adventures and go do these things and go do these places. I would wonder, wouldn't that feel like a ball and chain?
It may very well feel like a ball and chain, but I do think that there are some respects and compromises that she makes that she has to be met with a ball and chain, and likely that's why she has a falling out, or at the very least has a falling out in her mind that we see with the accountant, as opposed to the person that she truly loves. The safer option that probably helped her out through a lot of things inside the past.
The accountant who remains unnamed.
Unnamed, because we can't fully correlate whether or not that's the same accountant or not. Who knows how the names get jumbled up, because again, the name is absent.
But it's not 100% clear in the return that he's an accountant, is it?
It's not.
I mean, it makes
clear.
sense, but I don't think it's ever stated.
It's one of those cases where you can wonder, and I think this might be the intention of the absence of the name, is that she is confusing the name of the accountant and the life of the accountant with someone that is supervising her and seeing her. And that name is also converging.
With this book, sometimes the omissions are as glaring as the things that are included. Mm-hmm. And when it mentions the accountant, it for some reason, Tammy never mentions the name of the accountant, when she's pretty thorough about mentioning names for other people. So to just not say his name is Charlie makes it seem like either it's not the same guy or there's more going on here. Mm-hmm. And by the end, we don't really even know where Audrey is. 4 years ago, without warning, Audrey closed her salon and vanished from public life. So 4 years ago from the time of the final dossier, but 3 years ago from the events of the return. Mm-hmm. And people aren't sure what's going on. She just suddenly disappeared, and the Horn family will not say where she went. The fact that the Horn family won't say where she went, to me, is very suspicious. And I think it gives further evidence to there being more going on. Apparently around the town, there's rumors that it may be agoraphobia. So something like maybe with Harold, where she has a fear of leaving the house. Or she might be in some sort of private care facility, some sort of institution. I know that I side toward the institutionalized angle because I think that if she just simply wanted to be left alone and be more private, they maybe would have a different answer.
Yeah.
But I think the fact that the Horn family is keeping it so tight-lipped and so secret, and also that Richard Horn has to go to Sylvia for money, makes me think that Audrey is literally not available. She is not anywhere to be found.
No.
So she is probably locked up somewhere, and that also would make sense of the piercing white room and the white gown that she's wearing in part, whatever it was, 16 or 15, when she suddenly saw her reflection. And then this brings us to Ghostwood, where there's that line in The Return when Audrey said it's like Ghostwood in here. It's a very suspicious line, and it feels relatively important that it was in the script. And we do get clarity on Ghostwood here that Ben did sell his share of Ghostwood Forest, that later became a privately run prison. Started in 2001, immediately very controversial. Ben became one of the people who commented against it, saying it was a blight on our land. And yes, it offered new jobs for people that were displaced when the lumber mill went down, but it also was the arrival of more issues. Because when the prison showed up, there also was a sharp rise in the community of various maladies, such as alcoholism, depression, prescription drug abuse, drug trafficking, domestic violence, and suicide. All go up because of this prison. Or at least, coincidentally, when the prison shows up.
Just so happens. This just feels like a new form of a Packard mill, but instead of workers, it's just people's well-being.
And in a worse way in that regard.
Yes.
And we don't really know who the leadership is of this place, but it seems really awful. It has a terrible reputation even among privately run prisons. No one has any positive word to say about it. In fact, it's one of the most opinion-charged parts of Tammy's address. It feels like it's almost like a damning of privately run prisons as a political topic, rather than even anything about Twin Peaks anymore. Because it's pretty aggressively against it. Because Tammy even has to state for the record that, of course, the Twin Peaks Sheriff's Department is not affiliated with this thing. Like, she has to just go out of her way to state how bad this is, and no one good would ever be associated with it. And it's curious because if it's such a big deal in the community, it's literally on Ghostwood, and it was the result of that season 2 plotline. Should it have been in The Return? Like, should it have been more than that one throwaway line?
Then we need a prison venue for The Return.
Yeah, if only there was a prison in The
us.
Return.
But unfortunately, we can't go into what ifs or what could have beens. They just didn't have it.
Yeah. And of course, this is where we talked off pod about it. They did have a prison stuff with South Dakota, right? With Mr. C being apprehended there.
I just feel the distance is mostly not only to create more so of larger borders, which I think that they also try to explore with Mr. Green Glove.
Freddy.
What
do you mean he's your favorite character? How could you forget him?
Absolutely. But he's all across the planet, and the fireman is able to contact him. So I think that they were just trying to go for more of a global affair of how far these powers are reaching and how it then centers on Twin Peaks. And again, whether or not it slows Mr. C down, which
there's reasons you could argue for the plot that it has to be somewhere else. But I don't think if you were to look at the script before everything was filmed, I think you could retool it to have Ghostwood in there if you really wanted to. Mm-hmm. And that's, again, that overall recurring argument with this book is if they really wanted to put these things in The Return, they could have. So, why didn't they? If Frost was completely satisfied with The Return's writing, why was Ghostwood not in there, but then he went into it? Did he feel like it was better suited for the book? I don't know, because what is the book doing that we couldn't have got from The Return? All these questions start to surface, because when Audrey says that line, it's like Ghostwood in here, I feel like that's pretty heavily implying it's like Ghostwood prison in here. She feels like a prisoner, and that could rely not only...
No, it's just the idea of whether it's like Ghostwood. Oh, you mean the mini golf course? No, it's like calling Guantanamo Bay or Guantanamo. You don't say Guantanamo prison, you just say Guantanamo.
I just feel like with Audrey saying that, it could apply both to Charlie, but also if she's being held right now in a facility of some kind, she's comparing that sort of place in her cell to be like a prison. That makes sense.
Yes.
It's interesting to see the Ghostwood prison thing get adapted, because last time I think we saw that officially in media was through the Access Guide. It was being talked about being in development.
Yes.
So the Access Guide matters.
Literally at the last page.
A very ominous thing. And I remember I hadn't read the Access Guide by that point. When I first watched The Return, I only read the Access Guide when we looked at it. But I remember thinking about Ghostwood, and I wondered before The Return came out, is this going to be a big deal in The Return? Because you're taking this forest that's known to have spirits and kind of eerie happenings in it, and you're going to cut that down, take that all down, destroy the land, scar the natural land, and put up some kind of business shady venture. Now, I didn't know it was going to be a privately prison at the time. I think once you put it as a private prison, that even exacerbates it further. But I was thinking, how much danger is it going to be to put this stuff over this land. Like, there's all those horror stories like The Shining, where you could argue like it's over like an Indian burial ground or something, right? This feels like that kind of setup. So when the return didn't do anything with it, that felt really odd to me, not to take an environmentalist message, not to take a corporate message, not to talk about this whole thing. Because it was a really big part of Twin Peaks' original show that this land was going to be sold. And I feel like that would have been a great thing to follow up on. Not just because you need to, but because it was interesting to explore. What do you do with all the things that happened in the past 25 years with environmentalism and the problems facing our society? What do you do looking back at the long-term damage that happened from the Ghostwood Project? And they didn't do that in the return.
Nope.
And it's barely in this book. And I'm looking at it like this was a really big missed opportunity that was right there. But instead, this French woman has to slowly leave the room.
Save Ghostwood is being saved just like leftovers that have been there for weeks. And you look at it and it's like, should I get to this? I'll get to it later.
Speaking of things that have been left out for weeks and we don't know what's going on with it, Jerry Horn. He was left in the woods by himself. He walked into the woods and left himself there.
Yes, he
And he
did.
walked 1,000 miles and he didn't know if it was his own foot. And I don't know what to make of Jerry. I kind of was always on that field that I sided with Jerry Horn stuff mostly being silly, but there was always this lingering idea in my head that, well, if it's being shown so often, it might be important. And that this is not, I am not your foot. Maybe that's an important thing. Maybe he's experiencing things with spirits or aliens, or maybe something meaningful is happening.
Yes.
I feel like this book made me disbelieve that further because the only things in this book about Jerry are nonsense and silly stuff, to the point where it makes me think retroactively whatever was going on with them in the return was just a comedy bit. It doesn't have to be. I can choose to believe more than that, but this entire thing really feels as a comedy. And to be fair, this is one of the most fun sections of this book. The Jerry Horn part is memorable because Tammy gets to be funny. And I appreciate that because otherwise the tone doesn't shift that much. So Tammy says that Jerry's marijuana pursuits are poised on paper to become the most massively successful business endeavor in Horn Corporation history. Now, we don't know if all of Ben's pursuits added up how much money that equals. But I do want to know, what do you think of the fact that Jerry is poised to have the most successful single business venture over his brother Ben? Ben has spent a whole entire lifetime scheming and maneuvering all these shady business deals. Jerry just shows up at the right time, maneuvers things pretty cleverly, it sounds like, working within political spheres and kind of getting some intel along the way to make a very successful brand out of his weed business and just blow his brother out of the water.
You just have to be at the right place at the right time to be at the point of the gold rush, and it seems that Jerry Horn was at the ready with it. Mind you, the text of the book tells us that he's been high since 1969.
No, not just that. High is an orbiting communications satellite since approximately 1969.
Which is known as being high, yes.
And of course that lines up with Woodstock, which is the thing I'm thinking of right away. And it's perpetually as high as an orbiting communication satellite. So my question then from that is, does that mean Jerry Horn to you was perpetually high during the season 1 and season 2 sightings? Does that mesh with you? Do you think he was perpetually high every scene Jerry was in?
If he was perpetually high, he might have been just like outright maybe buzzed to a point. Like, I imagine that if he's using that to relax every day, that's fine. I think it's hyperbole more on the part of
Tammy
having
some fun.
Yep, having some fun, because I don't imagine like he's also built a mechanism for himself to have a little bit of a Scooby-Dooby-Dooby just dip into his mouth every like few hours as he's sleeping. Like
See, what you don't know about Twin Peaks is that every time like it cuts from Jerry like leaving a room with Ben or going somewhere off screen, he immediately pulls a joint out of his pocket. Just immediately off screen every single time it's happening. Or an edible of some kind.
Half of the fog that you see in the mountains of Twin Peaks, it comes from Jerry Horn.
This, of course, does recontextualize his love for eating whole cheese pigs and very large brie sandwiches.
Does it, though?
Brie and butter sandwich, yes.
Because, like, we see also Benjamin Horn who was told, like, more sandwich, to the point we see a man carve into the middle of a sandwich. I just thought it was, like, a family thing.
Yeah.
This is what you do with your families, just, like, bite into the middle of a sandwich.
The cheese pig was mostly Jerry, though.
Cheese pig was mostly Jerry, but how do you share a cheese pig?
It was a smoked cheese pig.
Yeah, it was a smoked cheese pig. How do you share a cheese pig?
You cut it in half?
No.
You could.
No, you couldn't.
Why couldn't you?
It's like breaking one of those, like, you know, those little like crackers.
You can
like,
cut cheese.
You can't cut like a cracker that's like an elephant. Like, you know those little like circus animal crackers?
Yeah.
You can't crack those and share them. No, you have to eat them whole.
No, you literally
No,
can
you
cut.
cannot do that. That is against the rules and terms of circus animal crackers.
Speaking of rules, Jerry Horn, very good about the rules of how to acquire licenses. When medical marijuana was decriminalized but not recreational, so you can only do medical, Jerry once attempted to get a license for medical marijuana, quote, in order to treat his addiction to marijuana, end quote. See, it's a fun part of the book.
It's a fun
enjoyable.
part of the book. I'm not denying it's not a fun part of the book.
And this leads to the obvious reveal we've all been waiting for, that Jerry was really good friends with Dr. Jacoby. They were buds.
Sure they were. I can imagine they most certainly were. Dr. Jacoby and Jerry, very much on the same level of highness.
So we got drugs as a common thing between them. Now, not before, now we do. Because there was like no scene in the original I could think of where Jerry and Dr. Jacoby said a single word to each other or so much as locked eyes.
I don't think they were even in the same room.
Maybe
like,
at a
maybe
funeral
maybe
or
at
a
the
wake or
Confederate
something.
Scene, but...
Confederate, yeah. Something, maybe they were around each other, but I feel like this is definitely a retcon. Because if they were good buddies, they had plenty of times they could have been around each other but weren't. Anyway, but I think it's kind of believable in the sense that Jerry is someone who likes to travel the world. He's, you know, this cultured sort of man. It's established in the books especially, but we see that in the show. So if we think about how obviously Dr. Jacoby has Hawaii as an interest, he's got full of Hawaii stuff all over his house and everything. But even beyond Hawaii, he has been to other places, visited other cultures. He's very interested in like shamanic people and all these sort of things. Do I think that Jerry and Dr. Jacoby could have had an interesting series of conversations about the world and the people of the world and their practices? Yes, I do. I could see them getting along. It's just we're being told about it without it ever actually being shown to us ever in front of us. Mm-hmm. So it's like, I believe you. Sure.
I believe you.
That makes sense. But also, if you were to like
Parenthesis.
ask me in Twin Peaks, are these two characters friends? I would say, according to a book. I wouldn't be able to say like confidently, yes, right?
I
It's
don't
just
think
not
you-
enough.
I don't think you could, and I don't think I could. So that kind of like narrows down for the people in this room, at least.
Whereas, again, this is where I think our levels of headcanon come in. If you asked me, was Dougie Milford an important character, I would have to look at you holding back a laugh and say, no. Like, I'd just be like making various sounds because in my heart, I'm thinking, yes, he's the most important character.
I think it's one of those responses that if you experience as much like detail into Twin Peaks, it's not a response that doesn't start off without the word, well.
Yeah, he's lower on the iceberg.
Yeah.
Right, you have to do a little bit of digging before you realize all of the Dougie that's out there. and this is where I think The Secret History, again, succeeded in really selling me on a main character. Mm-hmm. We just don't have that kind of thing. Like, we're not jumping between characters to the extent of, like, getting recurringly Douglas Milford updates and getting his own voice in the picture. If that kind of thing was given to Jerry and Jacoby, either in this book or the previous, I'd believe it then. Because there'd be something to hold on to. There'd be a memory between them or something. But we're left to do all the work, right? You know, we're just being left here holding
We
out.
have to build the ship ourselves. It's like a fun puzzle. Don't you like puzzles?
The last thing I want to share with Jerry, I have nothing to say. I just think it's funny, is that we get names for Jerry's marijuana strands. And some of the names that are very potent strands include, whose hands are these? Collateral damage. And the center will not hold.
Ha.
I just think those are very funny. I'm a big fan of the center will not hold.
It's somewhat eloquent.
It's a poem.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Good job, Jerry.
Yeah, we're it's actually kind of an ominous poem if you're not familiar with it, which this gives me a perfect time to talk about that poem. Those not familiar, this is The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats. Hope I'm saying the name right. I've always struggled with it because it looks like Yeats, and I've been told it's not Yeats. That's not it.
Yolks.
Anyway, William Butler Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dim tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while most are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming! Hardly are those words out when a vast image of the Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with a lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? What a great name for weed.
You only got the one clap because this is just a very elaborate weed joke that we went into the details of explaining the elaboracy of this weed joke.
What I think's funny is if you were to tell me in advance that Twin Peaks: The Return referenced that poem, I would think of a very serious instance where, like, it could tie into, like, Bob and Judy and the destruction of the world and the anarchy and all this sort of stuff. But no, it's used as a weed joke. And I think that's very funny. I think that's very funny,
I'm glad you think it's funny, Kalil.
Do you not think it's funny?
I don't enjoy the films such as Harold and Kumar. I do not partake on this type of humor.
Well,
it is not my style.
This is a classical
illusion. I don't
illusion.
like this hat.
Okay, the humor is classical illusion with an ironic twist. Who doesn't love that? Who is not all about that?
Me.
Okay, I know your sense of humor. I remember how funny you found it when Leo Johnson was in Fire Walk with Me and he was doing the "This is where we live" speech. You remember that, cleaning the floor and all that stuff?
Yes.
Funny moment.
Yes.
Funny moment.
Yes.
Speaking of Leo Johnson, totally didn't intend on this being a segue.
Absolutely
It was so
not.
natural, I didn't even realize.
Oh boy, it's so great as I scroll down into my Google document
to the
next
thing
part.
in the notes.
Yeah.
So Leo, we find out he got bit by them spiders. But it turns out those tarantulas were not poisonous, which actually makes a lot of sense. They wouldn't. Okay, cool.
Cool, yeah.
So you're thinking, oh, Leo lived then. No, of course not. He got shot multiple times.
Because why wouldn't he?
Why wouldn't he? And it's implied that probably Wyndham Earl did it.
Probably.
That's the most
it's not
likely.
revealed.
It's not revealed, but it's the most likely option
Which
here.
is the result of, like, hold on to the spiders there. And then he walks and is like, oh, wait, I think I forgot something. Poo, 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 poo. I think it's more likely, personally myself, if I will, is that Leo Johnson held on to spiders for a very, very, very long time, like maybe even a few days, maybe got a little hungry. And then Mr. Seacoop comes out of the little hole that he came in and is like, oh, you're here.
Loose ends.
Poo, poo, poo,
I
poo.
100% agree. I think it's interesting. I mean, I'm not opposed to Tammy concluding it might be Wyndham Earl because I think it's a bit of a leap to suggest anyone else.
Yeah.
But I think given what we saw as viewers, it would make no sense. I don't even know when Wyndham Earl would have time to go back. He doesn't. And I think the fact that in the last episode, it cuts to that very humorous quick cut of Leo struggling with the spiders. Then it goes back to the scene it was doing otherwise. Like, it's just that little moment to remind you he's still there. And in film language, I take that to mean a long time has passed. Like, he hasn't just been in there for a minute and then Wyndham Earl comes back and shoots him.
Yeah, I don't think that they're just showing flashcards to the audience being like, do you remember this moment? Okay, good. It doesn't matter
I think he's
anymore.
still there.
Yeah.
So I agree that he might have been struggling for a while. He accidentally dropped the spiders on him, but he's still stuck. The spiders can't poison him, so he just got bit. What really killed him was the dude who showed up a little bit later, who would not be Wyndham Earl probably.
Either later or early. We don't know
What
how
is
long
time?
he held the spiders.
Yeah, what is time? I agree, though. I think it's more likely Mr. C, even though that's not what the book suggests. I just think Wyndham Earl makes less sense, and I also don't know why Wyndham Earl's motives would change. If he was cool with leaving it up to the spiders to do it, why would he all of a sudden return?
Because he knew the spiders wouldn't kill him. He had to finish the job. It's all about getting in people's heads and then something the Joker.
The best way to fight the Joker is with love. It's something I often say to myself, unprompted, when alone or in public spaces. I already kind of alluded to this earlier with the idea of generational cycles, but Shelley's backstory is explained here, and would you know it, she was the child of a dysfunctional family marriage that ended in divorce, and then there was alcohol and drug abuse in this situation with spousal abuse, i.e. it sounds like the exact same thing that was going on with Leo and her. So it's this recurrence that she ended up falling with Leo, similar way that her parents had the similar issues. And then Becky was poised with Stephen to have similar issues here. Mm-hmm. And it seems like the through line is that Becky may have been saved from this cycle through the love and support of her father especially, but probably also Shelley too, that they were able to kind of break Becky out. Also, Stephen dying in the woods maybe helped break out of the cycle as well.
Yep.
But that was a little bit outside anyone's control as far as I can tell as well. It just, sometimes that happens.
Yeah, sometimes Mark Frost walks
Zebras,
into the woods and you die.
unicorns, whatever he talked about incoherently.
No, I do think that Shelley is just one of those cases where, yes, Becky has saved her from the cycle, but I do think Shelley is still actively inside that cycle.
And this is where there's another elephant that this time was not in the room, but so far away from the room, and that's Red. Not like John Justice Wheeler, where I expect him to get brought up. More with Red, it's like this feels like a missed opportunity to me, because if you're going to make this book to go through and give backstory on characters and explain things, the character who showed up one time did a magic trick, and then otherwise all we know is dating Shelley, just seems like a character maybe to flesh out, maybe to do something with in your other material.
Well, Red was a genius with a infinity
He actually-
IQ that ended up passing all the tests.
He would be
I
taken
graduated
to-
at 16.
He'd be taken to magic shows by professional magicians and point out live in front of the audience how they did their tricks, thus shaming and ruining their careers, but also he's so brilliant with it.
And then the magicians beat him up, and he got sad, and then he,
was
went to
so
drugs.
smart, he knew where to let them hit him so he wouldn't sustain big injuries, and then he knew their pressure points and he took them out.
And so he tried to become a magic man afterwards, like how Batman ended up having an instance with bats. He became a magician man. That's how he does the dime thing.
That's how he does the time.
It
thing.
all works together.
I don't know. All joking
We
aside,
had to do the lifting, but we got it.
all joking aside, I do wish Red had been elaborated on. If you're gonna give this treatment to characters, I'd like it to be ones that I almost know nothing about, that maybe you could make more interesting and more compelling. Give them something to work with, because I feel like Red was an abandoned half concept in The Return.
But Red has nothing to do with Agent Cooper or the case. We have no other examples of
No
things
other
that-
examples of the book detouring. And here's the thing, where Red does connect enough that he connects to Richard Horne, and he connects with the drug operations in the town, which clearly Tammy likes to write about. And she also connects to Shelley and Bobby. So it's like, this does connect, actually, as much as anything else does.
Pardon me, Mark Frost. Could you walk into the studio, please? Hello there. I'm Mark Frost, and I'm here to say that she just probably didn't have enough time. Thank you very much, Mark Frost. Have a nice day.
Well, put a pin in that, because you're spoiling the audience. You're doing a foreshadowing, aren't you?
I'm doing a little foreshadowing.
A little foreshadowing over
here.
here.
Little shadow with the number 4.
Does it add to the number of completion?
No.
No, it does not. With Shelley, Tammy and Albert both remark in this book about how Gordon Cole is explicitly interested in Shelley and fond of Shelley, which is mind-blowing, because that would mean that Gordon Cole, 25 years later, is still talking about Shelley enough that it's a reputation among the people he works with.
But Kalil, don't you understand? She was the one that the Cole communication.
Do you understand?
That rarely ever happens, man. Like, it's that memorable person that you meet, and they stay with you for the rest of your life.
It's one of those things that feels like
touching
it's
moment.
only in there because fans know the Shelley and Gordon Cole stuff. Gordon Cole seems like kind of a womanizer. Like, at the very least, he enjoys his time with women, and he tries as much as possible to be around what he considers beautiful women. I just don't think that this one we happen to know from 25 years ago would be the main one he talks about all the time to his coworkers.
Yeah, honestly, it's one of those cases where I think that the instance in The Return where, Albert says, "I know you heard me,"
Right.
is something that it could be damnable on a past scene without this extra bit of book, where, say, for example, if you really wanted to be attached to someone or
Right, he could suddenly make this whole story.
he can make this whole story and spin it off being like, hey, no, I can actually hear you normally. He's behaving everyone else except for a lovely woman. That could also tie to the FBI situations like, Gordon Cole, I know you and your past history. And that would be an example of it, but it's no longer an example of it if it's a mystical thing.
And again, it's like, is this really cool storytelling that we have so much ambiguity to question the character's motives? Or is this kind of bad because the story's telling us one thing and we're deconstructing it and doing the opposite just naturally?
Shelley Johnson is the earliest example of she has the stuff. What's the stuff? I don't know, but she has it. Gordon Cole likes it.
Pretty's the stuff. I hate to it might be the stuff. It might
It's not
be
dandruff?
It's either dandruff or it's pretty. One of the two. One of the two, man. God dang. You know who's not described very prettily in this story? in the soul kind of pretty.
I like to say Gordon Cole, but I think this is a segue to
No,
go away.
Vivian.
Vivian.
So if you remember Vivian from the original show, she was the one was the one who was like the MT Wentz, the critic, and she left that scathing review for her daughter's diner. I kind of defended it a little bit because I don't think you should just give a good review because she's your daughter. I think you should be honest for your job and say what the truth is. However, in every other way, she also just seemed kind of cold and calloused. It seemed like she was not a very good mother, not a very good person. That being said, I did recognize her as a human being. That was my mistake. Mark Frost has clarified that. Tammy has clarified it. This is not a person. This is evil incarnate.
It's just Satan. Like, what's wrong with having Satan
Little Nicky
here?
was not Satan.
No, it was
Vivian was
Vivian.
Satan. And this is where I think it's overkill. That almost everything we get about Vivian is horribly negative in this. And I'll kind of let you be the judge as we go along. And maybe we'll cycle back to this when all is said and done with Vivian. She doesn't get a single positive trait.
Vivian, throughout her life, has constantly led people towards not so great scenarios, to the point that she is always seems to be the victor of the situation. She is someone that is emphasized as being absolutely uncaring, callous to a point of extreme fault, to the point that I think it's just to make the people around her more miserable for the story, but also give Tammy Preston by the end.
It is stated that she directly sent her kid to a boarding school just to get rid of her, and then later sent her to like a convent to get rid of her. It just seems like she just doesn't want her family around. And then also we find out parts where Tammy's describing, quote, the chilling glimpse into this woman's pathological indifference to every person around her makes your blood run cold. And I'm like, don't you tell me how my blood runs, Tammy. You don't know, unless the you is specifically Gordon Cole. I don't know.
The ultimate evil was Vivian all along. I think what it
She
does...
deserves a special place in hell. Quote Tammy.
Quote Tammy.
Who doesn't even know her. Never met her, and she's like, I damn her. Sure.
I definitely damn her, without
God
second
dang.
thoughts. It's something that I think it gives Tammy a moment of passion for Tammy book to really fall into.
She's like reading this like narrative of people she's never even met before, and she's just like casting immediate condemnation. No wonder, because Vivian has nothing positive about her, apparently.
There's not anything positive on the record for her. And
I don't know. I find characters that are more complex and nuanced usually more interesting. You can have fun with wicked characters like Wyndham Earle. He can be fun. But I feel like Vivian, I just assumed she was a bad mom. I didn't assume she was, oh, yeah, she might have tampered with the brakes and killed her ex-husband. Kind of evil. I did not know that.
This is why we need that Cruella-style spin-off, of someone who's known as Cruella de Vil, literally the devil.
Yep.
We need the backstory on Vivian to
don't
show that
knock
she's
Cruella.
actually
Cruella's a good movie.
misunderstood.
I'll
She'll
stick
carry
my sword
the
on this
3
hill.
Cerberuses with her.
So this is just a mess to me. I don't know. I thought it was overkill. But the thing that's most glaring about the Vivian section is this seems to be the most direct time that Mark Frost is addressing an error with The Secret History of Twin Peaks. And I do not know how else to reconcile what's going on, if not that. I think it is course correction. I think it is acknowledging, a year later after The Secret History came out, acknowledging, yeah, that was a mistake. Because it starts off with Tammy explaining that there was something wrong with the previous dossier. Quote, either misdirection or misinformation. And that was when Dale Cooper was writing about Norma Jennings's father. That was kind of weird that something was wrong there. Apparently, there's some misinformation. Let's go ahead and set the record straight.
As far as the record is going, we once heard that Marty, that's
Marty Lindstrom,
Lindstrom father figure and so on, was noted to be having heart disease. Now, Kalil, when you think heart disease, what do you think?
Heart disease. Medically diagnosed heart disease.
Exactly, medically diagnosed by the good Dr. Hayward, as in it's the hurt of the heart,
Yeah, as
where
in
you
is
are
having an affair.
cheating with someone. Yes,
So
that is the disease of the heart.
When Norma's mother is said to have lost Marty, it wasn't to heart disease. He didn't die. He just left her for a different woman.
Yeah.
And this is all bending over backwards to explain, if I understand and remember correctly, that Secret History said that Norma's mother was named Ilsa, like a different person. When anyone who's seen Twin Peaks and remembers Vivian is going to be like, we met Norma's mother. How can this be? So the book has to explain how this could be true, but also the other thing could be true, but in a kind of a different sort of way.
It's a glitch. It's a glitch.
It's all a glitch, different timelines.
Don't worry about
and
it.
It's all Tammy's fault. She didn't sleep enough. She's in a parallel universe.
The past created a page, and we screamed.
Why would Cooper, either real Cooper or Mr. C, make up fake names about Norma's mom and write about heart disease that wasn't really heart disease? I don't know. He's evil
The
or
number
confused.
4.
The number 4.
Foreshadowing.
I don't know, man. I just think all this doesn't work. Vivian is said to basically be the mother of Annie, but not the mother of Norma, like, biologically, but Norma treats Vivian nicely for Annie's behalf. So when Vivian is there, Norma knows it's like her stepmother, not her real biological mother. That's Ilsa. Different character. This is a mess. This is not multiple timelines. This is just actually badly constructed. Needs an editor.
Nah.
I don't mean to be mean, but also this is how I feel.
It's not exactly the best structured situation here for the book. We know that. We understand, but at the same time, this is a big example.
This is a really big example, and it seems like the main reason it's here is to set the record straight, but then also allow them to talk more about Annie directly and how Annie grew up under the tyranny of Vivian, therefore having an irredeemable mother who went through multiple husbands and may have killed one of them, as we're about to talk about. And that's why her family life had so many issues, with Norma really being the consistent recurring person, which I believe. I believe that Norma, when she learned she had this half-sister, she would go out of her way to try to keep that connection. Mm-hmm. Because of the way Norma reacts around Shelley, she seems to have a sort of instinct to try to help people, either as a mother figure or a sister figure, seeing that Annie had no one. And I think it's also believable that Norma, to kind of help Annie out, would keep it a bit of a secret what's going on and not make it like something everyone knows about. She's not one to brag up her own good deeds.
No.
So I think it makes sense it didn't come up in the original show. When she introduced Annie in season 2, she gave her a job right away. She kind of welcomed the community. It felt like Norma was trying to make Annie feel safe. That went wrong with a certain Dale Cooper, but everything else seemed like it was trying to keep Annie safe. So I actually think this is one of the retcons that works pretty well. But I'm going to challenge you, Professor.
Oh boy, I get to be challenged.
So, the trolley case. It's a very common thought experiment that people do, where usually you have a trolley, and it's a runaway trolley. It's going to end up causing a disaster, and there's 2 tracks.
Yes.
One has something, one has the other, and there's a lever you can pull that'll switch the track. It's a moral thought experiment.
Okay.
So,
I'm known for not having those.
the one we're going to do here is that on one track, the runaway trolley is going to hit, it's set to this track, is Annie.
Okay.
Annie's tied up on the track like a vaudeville rolling his mustache villain has done.
It's
probably Wyndham Earl actually did this. I could totally imagine Wyndham Earl in one of those old sepia like movies or cartoons going up like a crab walk and then tying up Annie and then skittling away.
I can only imagine.
And the other track is Shelley, which also Wyndham Earl crab walked and put Shelley on the track.
Yes.
Now, Norma has the lever in front of her. If she pulls the lever, the train will not run over Annie. She will save Annie, but it will go over and run over Shelley. Would Norma pull the lever?
The hardest part about this is thanks to a consideration that I bring up thanks to Fortnite, which, by the way, has a zone called Twine Peaks. Just a fun little pun right there.
What's it referencing?
It's probably referencing Riverdale. I don't know.
Okay. I thought it was Gravity Falls.
But the idea of the trolley problem, going through scenarios where one cannot win and there's like no victory in sight, the only best way to solve the problem, as one of the characters comes to terms with and realizes after trying to save everyone, is that you have to be the one on the track in order to solve the problem. You have to willingly be able to let yourself be the one to go. And so if there was a possibility for her to literally throw herself into the ring until it either stop it for both of them or get it to a point that can potentially stop it, I think that she'd sooner like stop the trolley by just leaping in front of it rather than having to choose between these two people.
It's the type of thing in which either she would try to find the solution or force this solution and maybe come out failing from it. But I do not think that Norma has the capacity to make that decision. I genuinely think
In either case, whether it was switched, which one is on which track.
Yes. I think that she would ignore the lever and just try to leap in and try to find something out.
Because it's a thought experiment. There's only 2 options. You can't just make a third one. That defeats the point of the thought experiment.
Making third options is kind of what is done through Twin Peaks, though.
Oh, don't you do this to me.
Look
there's
at
the
Cooper.
Black Lodge and there's the White Lodge.
And where are we in the
2
Mauve
lodges.
Zone?
That's part of one of those. There's no such thing as a gray area. What are you talking about?
The log of Margaret Lannerman. Which one is that? If you are so much, this is part of this lodge or that lodge, tell me, what's the log Margaret Lannerman
The difference
has?
is I'm talking about thought experiments. Those are real. That's the difference here. That's the big difference. I just have, with Annie, we just have to talk about this because with Annie's story, I think this is a bad case of, again, overkill, not so much with how Vivian was evil, but this time with how Annie has nothing positive in her life. And before, with original Twin Peaks, all we really knew is that Annie had been in a convent after something horrible happened and it was left open. And you know what? That was fine. If we got an answer of what happened, that'd be okay, as long as the answer was really interesting and compelling and made a deeper dive into the character or was a worthwhile thing to explore. But I was okay just knowing she went through a tragic past. This book goes and tells us why it's tragic, but in a way that allows for no glimmers of hope.
It's something where there's horror upon the character to the point that you almost wonder why. Mostly because there are points of representation that I think are very ill-handled, thanks to it becoming a checklist of bad things happening to the character with not much of what happens with her, like how she handles it or how her mental faculties are. It's something that in this day and age is something that can't really be overlooked because it's recognizing that she's going through a lot of pain. There's multiple examples before and after meeting of Cooper where she self-harms, where she does indeed cut herself and she's found bleeding. And through
Some of which is related to a suicide attempt. She has multiple suicide attempts in this book.
Yes, she tried to take her life multiple times, and without any proper sort of like handling of it, the execution itself just seems like harm for harm's sake at times. And
you have to be really
poor.
careful and apply different sets of standards when you're talking about really sensitive material like this.
Yes.
I think the moment you start talking about mental health concerns and safety concerns and issues of sexual assault, I think that different standards apply than if you're talking about the history of a race car driver or something. Like, I think this is a different kind of material, and that's why I have a lot of respect for the Secret History of Twin Peaks for being more personal about it and giving more of a viewpoint from Laura's perspective, telling her story.
Not the Secret History of Twin Peaks.
I
Laura's
said
diary.
I meant the Secret Diary. I'm sorry.
No, I was
I'm
going
getting
to say the same
confused
thing.
about the secrets.
No, I was going to say the same thing. We literally go through someone's pain, someone's ideas, passions, and also the experiences that they've had firsthand from Laura. This is very much, if it's not done by first person's perspective, you really got to just find a way to
list.
It's just a list in
And
this
that's
case.
really unfortunate. I do have to say one of the most egregious ones here is that Agent TP Tammy doesn't know for sure, but suspects, and we're given no other reason to believe otherwise, we're given no other possibility, but reasons out that most likely when Annie in her senior year of school was visiting home for Christmas, her stepfather, Roland Blackburn, after a night of heavy drinking, most likely sexually assaulted her or attempted to.
Mm-hmm.
And again, because we're given no other possibility, it's like, oh, I guess that happened. And then we have Roland driving off the bridge. Either that was suicide or murder from Vivian. And then Annie tries to commit suicide. And the amount of times that someone is referencing suicide in this book is kind of staggering in a way that it's just, after a while, really numbing. And it's just tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. She gets sent off to this Catholic boarding school that's described as almost militant and old, archaic, medieval. And then you get sent off to the convent because the mother wants to get rid of her, and that's the only option right now. And then she's in the mental institute, and Norma can't take care of her because she's trying to kill herself all the time. And it's just all of these bad things that I don't know. I kind of just feel numb when I'm reading them because it doesn't feel like I'm hearing Annie's story. I'm just hearing someone else list some bad things.
Annie gets very much snuffed out and kept to the side, but I do also think that I do think that the hardest part of this book for me becomes the Annie area, because with all this being said, with all the horrors that have been kept in mind, keeping Annie from what we've experienced from Twin Peaks, and also the notes of like Twin Peaks in general, especially with Fire Walk with Me, inside of her space when she is being taken care of at this home, every year on the anniversary at the exact same time of what she experienced inside the lodge, she does speak out audibly to no one in particular, "I'm fine." And as a reminder, the constant note that we've made jokes and memes on constantly, but still the very important question that came through from Cooper from the end of season 2, "How's Annie? How's Annie?" That call out with "I'm fine" is something that is honestly like kind of powerful for the
I think
respects.
it's really compelling for a lot of reasons. If we look at the return, Cooper in all of his shapes and forms does not seem to care about Annie or ask about her.
No.
Meaning that in all of this time where Cooper has moved on, the world has moved on, hardly anyone outside, maybe privately Norma, does anyone care about Annie? So for her to just say once a year to no one, "I'm fine," when no one's asking and no one's caring, there's a dark poetry to that. Like, this is something where when I read this for the first time, when I read the final dossier, a lot of that book is a blur. When I read it years ago, because I was overshadowed with other things I was experiencing, I was already mixed on the return and secret history. So final dossier, I wasn't really giving a fair shake. But the one thing I really remembered about the final dossier was that part with Annie. And I think it is the strongest part of the book. It's my favorite part of the book. And only after we get through one of the worst parts of the book with Annie. It's like you just go from some really bad things to some really interesting ideas that are worth exploring and chewing on.
Because with this story, we do have Annie Blackburn that she's escaped the lodge, but her mind is never the same thereafter. Like
And her body isn't either. It's not
No.
even aging.
It is not aging physically. She is just going through the motions. She's very despondent. She will accept things such as food, but elsewise, she is very stoic and oftentimes just looking off and away.
Even while her eyes are being described as containing a mysterious internal life and looking vivid. So she's like alive inside, but outside not.
She's very much just a preserved human being.
Literally the most Twin Peaks character you can get. She is dead, yet she lives. She's stuck in the past, yet she's ageless. There's so many ways that this ties into the themes of Twin Peaks, in particular the themes of Twin Peaks The Return, that this being in the book and not in The Return is itself a curiosity to me.
It's very striking. Like, one scenario that off pod you and I were talking about, one that I suggested, is if we were to like take something from this book and adapt it in, because I think this is the one thing.
This is the one thing that could have been in The Return very quickly.
This is the orb that I'm grabbing, the golden orb that I would shunt into the Twin Peaks world via Dido. And
Dido, Dido. Ditto.
But have something such as like at the start of the series, if you will, like to kind of like show maybe on one end a promise, but also on another end a feeling, a vibe that is just off with the tone sort of immediately being captured, is like just start before you hit the intro credits of just her sitting down inside of this home. You don't even have to introduce the character if you want someone to say it offhandedly in the background.
Just have a nurse with
that.
her.
Nurse
like,
with her.
"Hi, Annie, I'm going to help you up now," because, like, she's desisted right now.
You could do that. I'm saying that the name may not matter fully.
The show has a good habit of not telling you names other than credits.
So even with that respect, whether or not that is there, she's sitting there absently. You hear things going on in the background, and you let the scene sort of stir, but you are getting the idea that this is all the characters doing. They are just absently looking away. It could be out a window. It could be at a wall. It is just absently staring. And she just says, "I'm fine." I think that puts away a lot of the issues as it cuts to black and goes into the rhythms and the music of Twin Peaks. For one, it doesn't have to match up with timelines, because apparently this issue happens around like March, April.
Yep, when season 2's finale would happen.
As opposed to like this September, October situation.
But if you had it before the opening, you could have plausible deniability that could be any time.
Exactly. It could be at any time. It's absent, but it also is something that can engage to what is to come in the series.
And I'm also okay if we do mess with the timeline and just not have it be in April. I'm okay with that too, because I think it's worth it. I think it's worth breaking and smudging that little rule about when it happens to get it in the return. And what makes this harder is that Heather Graham, the actor who plays Annie, stated that she was interested in being in Twin Peaks: The Return, but she wasn't asked. And I've seen a few different sources quote her on that she was simply not asked to be part of Twin Peaks: The Return. And this is one of those things that I think was a mistake, because I think it does a disservice to the character. And while I don't think that, the creators or Twin Peaks as a whole really owe much of anything to the audience, I do think when you're making a continuation or sequel, it is usually good to bear in mind promises or ideas that you've held up before. If you want to subvert them, if you want to defy expectations, Lord knows Twin Peaks likes to do that, and the creators do too. But I think this is one of those areas where How's Annie was the guiding question ending season 2, going presumably into season 3. I would stake a lot that if season 3 would have happened in the 90s, if Coop and other fan organizations would have had their way and Twin Peaks came back on the air in a year or two, I think the How's Annie question would have been answered in season 3 of Twin Peaks. And the 25 years later, to me, that promise doesn't go away. Not entirely. I think even one scene with Annie would be worth it for the character, for the moment of it, for what she means to Twin Peaks and for Cooper.
I think that the hardest part of what happens with Annie, I feel, is very heavily altered thanks to the presence of Diane. I genuinely do think that a lot of it is due to the fact that having the presence of Annie, who was a love interest with Cooper, would conflate with that.
Yep.
And there's also the issue genuinely with, say, for example, season 2 representation, but as an argument against that, number one is that the episode David Lynch directed is already referenced with the Doppelcoop. But also,
I'm losing my mind over
but
here,
also number
Professor.
2, Annie occurs not only in that, but also Fire Walk With Me as a very important character, something that David Lynch had a heavy
100%.
hand on.
100%. He chose to keep her in Fire Walk With Me. I'm laughing over here and losing my mind because I'm realizing my hot take that I do prefer Annie over Diane. And I don't even think I'm wrong. I believe myself because
I'm glad you believe yourself.
I understand that Diane is more of a character than Annie in the sense that Diane has a lot of screen time over the 18 parts of The Return, but not with Dale Cooper. And it's also not the right Diane. That's a tulpa. The amount of times that we see Cooper and Diane together is constrained to mostly silent appearances in 17 and then some awkward conversations in 18 and whatever was going on with that sex scene. So I'm over here looking at it that's not really that interesting or compelling to me. It's mostly being told they were a pair in the past and they had a great history by characters in the show or by David Lynch on the set. Whereas Annie, I actually got to see the chemistry between them, and I thought that Heather Graham and Kyle MacLachlan had a good chemistry. I do. Do I think Annie's character was rushed at the end? Yes, I do. Mm-hmm. But do I think that she was a better character than John Justice Wheeler? Yeah, I do. I do think that. You gonna fight me?
You're in a pose like you're ready to go down skiing.
I'm ready to go ski down the slope of truth and hit the tree of realization very soon.
And I feel like you're trying to convince me personally, thanks to that pose. But for the most part, I can see where you're coming from in that respect.
And I mean, at base, because I haven't seen the fan film Queen of Hearts, which is about Annie Blackburn. Haven't seen it. Do not know what it's like at all. I don't know if it's something I would love or be indifferent about. I don't know all those things. But I will say I get why someone would want to make a fan film about Annie. Mm-hmm. And I also think I'm glad it exists, and I respect the fact that they went for it, because I think Annie has untapped potential in Twin Peaks that both The Return and the Final Dossier kind of missed the mark on. The Return by not including her at all, and Final Dossier by doing what they did to her backstory and telling it without Annie's perspective, even if it was as simple as include a note or a message from Annie to Norma, like from a psychiatric facility or before the incident at the end of season 2. Include something in Annie's own voice that would at least help. It wouldn't feel like we're just listing tragedy.
It's one of those cases where the big flaw of Final Dossier is we do get small little notes and visuals of body charts from time to time, but for the most part having small little anecdotes, notes, or bloggings, if you had to place it inside the book and just tape it into there to get those other character perspectives, it just continues to feel like there are empty spaces and pockets in here that not Annie. Agent TP not having enough time constantly makes me think, hey, if you're speaking through Tammy Preston, are you saying right now, Mark Frost's code, you didn't have enough time since this is your insert?
Because the book is so small that it's it clearly wasn't too much content. Secret History is 3 or 4 times bigger.
Yeah.
And not to say a small book's a problem,
No.
but I think a small book full of holes and things to expand on is kind of a problem. Where you could have used more personal anecdotes like Secret History did and kind of flesh it out more. Maybe could have been interesting. One last note on Annie is that we said that at the exact time every year, she says, I'm fine. That time is 8:38 a.m. 8 plus 3 is 11. 11 plus 8 is 19.
Yes, it is.
1 plus 9 is 10. What's 10?
It's the number of stars that you give out of 10 when you think something is perfect, unlike this anecdote you're trying to give me.
I don't see what your problem is.
The number of completion, Kalil. It's the
Because
number of completion.
I'm just doing the same thing that David Lynch would do.
I
Do you disagree?
don't disagree. I know that's likely the reference still. But
I think it is a likely reference. I know that that's more of David Lynch's thing usually than Mark Frost. From at least we've heard Lynch say it. We haven't heard Mark Frost say the numerology stuff. But I think this was intentional. It could have been 8:39, unless there's like a clock shown in the season 2 finale I'm forgetting about. Which it sounds like there isn't because you're not telling me there is.
I'm looking through the files in my brain.
So
but not
unless I'm
finding
missing
any.
something, it could have been any number.
It could have been.
Annie Blackburn number. Annie number.
It's one of those cases where I'm not against like numerology. It's just that I have heard like snippets of it without much exploration of it.
No.
To the point that I'm being given the same sticky
We're-
note
we're
again and
literally
again.
in
I'm
the
like,
show.
Fine, okay, I got
Yeah.
it.
I love it because in the return, they just say it's the number of completion and don't explain.
Cool.
That's in the return. You saw that. So
yeah,
it's like, I'm just,
I know.
unless you got some other resource to use,
You're
I'm
supposed
just
to read it
quoting
for
the show.
yourself. Start lifting.
Just start
I
looking
enjoy
into
the lifting
numerology.
too. Numerology is just one of the ones that I don't like.
Because I remember back when we did the episode with Tibet, you were going to go gung-ho on Tibet research.
Oh, absolutely. There's even a full-ass Tibet book inside of Twin Peaks that I bought for myself.
Yeah?
Yeah.
How's that book been?
I enjoyed it for a little bit, but then life happened and I had to fall back. That's a long story.
You know, it's like
nothing
Smash
against the
Mouth
book.
once indicated, you know, it's not going to stop.
Don't stop coming in, we 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 don't stop coming in.
Speaking of the ceaseless continuance of life and the confusing whirlwind it could leave you in, James Hurley in The Return feels like a very much a shell of what he maybe used to be. He's lost that spark, and the book relays about the incident that he had before and how it basically left him no longer really having that love for the road. He comes back to Twin Peaks past 30. He had to go through like rehabilitation for his leg that was fractured during that incident. Contrary to maybe what I was kind of thinking, the incident, at least the book describes it, did not have a lot of impact on his, head or mind. I mean, obviously, going through a traumatic incident, that itself can be effective, but it
Yes.
wasn't a head injury or anything like that. It was a leg injury. Okay, he comes back to town, and when he gets back, he's getting this job with Ben Horn. He works at the Great Northern for like security purposes and stuff. Makes this cool friend named Freddie who tells him really wild stories about giants and stuff like that. And then like a day or two later, after Freddie's like talking about how he got this green glove, James witnesses his friend Freddie fight an extraterrestrial blob demon entity with his green glove, shout, "This is my destiny," and then punch that glob into the earth and destroy it. While Dale Cooper, who he hasn't seen since he was interrogated like 25 years ago, manifests in multiple forms and then disappears before their eyes.
Yep.
What do you think James did after that?
It's just another Tuesday. He probably just went back to his old gig. No, honestly, like, as far as...
Because it's a year later, according to Tammy's records, right? And she doesn't mention anything with James after the point of the return. What has he done in this last year after seeing that?
Honestly, like, if I had to guess, like, hypothetically speaking, if, like, after you experience that, what does James do? I think that I would lean on to Freddie as an angle, where he's made an actual friendship with Freddie that doesn't seem
I
like
wouldn't want to
it's
mess with
tied.
Freddie now.
I wouldn't want to mess with Freddie.
Keep your friends close.
But if Freddie put his hand forward, not the green
Not
hand,
the green one. Don't shake that one.
the other hand, and he's like, if Fair shakes it like, James, I know you're not living your best life, so why don't we try to find that best life for you? And then they do a buddy cop thing, except they're not cops, they're just buddies, and then they go off on adventures together.
Honestly, good for them. I love your headcanon. I like it a lot. It's interesting the book doesn't say that, right? Because the book could have said that last we heard James had picked a flight to England with Freddie Sykes and just leave it at that.
But don't.
But it doesn't, and that's interesting because we do get like occasional backstory elements on like characters and what they're doing later. So this was a totally possible route. It's just like Tammy didn't care to look at what happened to James later, or nobody knows, or nothing, or the possibility nothing happened. He just went back to work, and it's normal now. I don't know. We also find out some stuff with his backstory that
Monday, ho ho ho, wish it were Sunday, ho ho ho, 'cause that's my fun day, ho ho ho. I don't have a glove day,
which is every day for James, who apparently we get follow up with the Evelyn Marsh case. I did not expect Evelyn to like matter in this book. I forgot we even mentioned her when I reread it. But yeah, it goes through the Evelyn Marsh stuff a little bit, how James, went there and did some things with the lawyer stuff, but they like ripped him apart and basically threatened to like find him under perjury or something. And he's like, oh no. And then he flees to Mexico as a result. Little overstepping what was maybe necessary here. It was more just a kind of a threat. And then he just goes to Mexico, in which case he accidentally, through unwitting adventures, ends up with the cartel. And he does cartel things for a little bit on accident, helping them as a mechanic, to the point where Sheriff Truman, Harry Truman, has to call a certain FBI director, which, is clearly Gordon Cole, and call him and talk about James, which I just wonder what that call would have been, because Gordon Cole never met James, as far as I know. So just Harry on the line, like, Gordon Cole, this is Harry Truman from the Twin Peaks Sheriff Department, and we got ourselves in a little bit of a pickle. He wouldn't say quandary. What does Harry say? Is he pickle? Does Harry say pickle?
Yeah, he's a pickle guy.
Little bit
call
of
him
a pickle. And James Hurley, he's a good kid. He's done something with the cartel in Mexico. And Gordon Cole is like, Mattel makes great toys for tots. No, Gordon. Cartel, like drugs. Hugs are great for children too. Every child should be hugged by their parents.
At this point, someone's got to, like, physically... There has to be, like, a limit where someone, like, doesn't even acknowledge anything anymore, just, like, reaches for the dial and turns it up for him.
I wonder what that call was like. That's all I got. That's all the James stuff I got. He's not in the book very much. It's not really a lot. It just addresses, yes, James exists.
It just sounds like James's life has been like a miserable version of like a Teen Titans, like a montage musical, like the Mad Mod situation where like upbeat music is happening and then suddenly he's in the cartel.
It's more just underwhelming than miserable. It's not like he faced tragedy after tragedy after tragedy of unspeakable horrors. It's more that it just kind of fizzled out.
It doesn't seem like there's many positives though, regardless.
But also
it fizzles out in like the mud.
But this is a question, was James really having a lot of positives in Twin Peaks in general? Not really. Like, Laura dies, and then horrible things happen as a result, with the Evelyn story in particular. And the Donna stuff was always strained, and Maddie died. Like, I think, like, in general with Twin Peaks, his story was pretty tragic.
There's a reason why it's called the Swamp of Sadness and Never-Ending Story. He's just been in the muck, and he keeps sinking down. I'm sorry, but the only positive he has in his life is Freddy.
That's true, and I hope they're happy together. Making new adventures. I genuinely, like, that'd be really fun. I like the idea of that. I kind of wish that was what the book did with them. That'd have been fun. It'd been really fun. Like, if the entire book didn't happen and we got a spin-off story with James and Freddy, I'd be fun. I'd be down. I don't even like Freddy and I'd be down. I don't like James or Freddy. But maybe you could make it fun,
Maybe you could make it fun with them together.
We haven't had much of that yet.
Together forever. And it recontextualizes the song Together Forever. It's not about love anymore, it's about friendship.
Just you, my best friend from England.
And I.
Speaking of Together Forever, we also get Big Ed and Norma confirmed to be married. And James plays a song, so I guess he's still in town, isn't he? If he played a song. Could be over Skype.
It depends how fast
we don't know if it was in person.
It could have been like the same
That's
day.
True. Could have been the same day.
As like the punching.
Right after.
Or
before.
Immediately. Or before.
Yeah, we don't know how time works.
Yeah.
And Andy Bald, Hawk even got a tear in his eye because his old friend Big Ed's Hurley.
Bald isn't crying as not the hair matter for
What'd
Andy.
I say?
You said Andy Bald. So you were talking about crying from his eyes.
Bawling.
Andy is bald.
No.
I'm just going to kick him in the shins while I'm over here.
Hawk had a tear in his eye because his old friend Big Ed's His Hurley luck had finally turned. Isn't that cute?
It's so cute because they keep bringing up Hurley luck every chance they get.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this wasn't necessary, but if you are going to follow up a year later, it makes sense to tell us.
Yeah.
It has a reason to be there, even if it's not a big deal. I kind of just assumed that was how it was going to go.
It's a cute conclusion for something in which, like, there's a positive thing that happened in Twin Peaks.
Maybe a less cute conclusion from how you were talking about it was the rumors, not confirmation, but rumors with nothing to the contrary, that Nadine is now dating Dr. Jacoby.
I hate it.
So
I hate it.
I quickly agreed with you once you started talking about it, but let's have it reenacted so I can quickly agree with you again.
Nadine being in a relationship with Dr. Jacoby is wrong on so many levels. Like, there's obviously, like, in the past, they were both patient as well as doctor.
Power dynamics.
There's one. That's the first one.
Yes.
The little mark on the chalkboard for the power dynamic. But also, Nadine has been following along with Dr. Amp onto his show, is a big fan, has been changed life, and even is interacted with him in that respect. There's already a power dynamic right there. It's a parasocial issue with this sort of celebrity-like figure that she might find endearing. There's just nothing that's not so much swayed in Jacoby's side that becomes outright irresponsible at this point, especially if we are taking this just at the very barest end of, say, for example, the journey with Tammy Preston. That's exactly at a year afterwards, 365 days to the day, that this would even happen. It still is heavily uncomfortable.
This is one of those, again, where I feel like we are going against what the main obvious message of the story would be, because it doesn't sound like when Tammy brings it up that it's meant to be a bad thing. And when it happens in the return, it's also not presented as a bad thing. If anything, it allows Ed and Norma to be happy, so it's a good thing. But even when I watched it in the return, I felt like I don't like this as the ending of Nadine's story. I don't like this as Nadine's conclusion to her narrative. I feel like for all the problems Nadine had in season 2, I get some of the criticism there. I still feel like this is not good in the return. I don't quite like this. And it also feels like the book is trying to promote the idea that Dr. Jacoby is generally good, though. Tammy goes and says how good he is, that he donates like 90% of his profits to charity, and she kind of respects this leftist Alex Jones guy, that he generally is speaking some truth, and she has some respect for this old man, this old way of trying to speak to the power. And she talks about how Jerry and Jacoby were weed buddies, and almost all of it is good. Almost all of this is meant to be positive on Jacoby. So I feel like we're doing the thing we sometimes do, and I don't think it's a bad thing, where we're looking at the material and we're like, yup, I hear and see what you're doing, but in actuality, no. No.
Yeah, no, I'm not a big fan of it. Then again, I'm also not a big fan of, say, for example, romantic angles with the hero. Like, anyone that's, like, seen as, like, doing the positive thing that they end up transactionally then gaining a relation from that situation. So
Is Jacoby the hero? Or
Jacoby
is Nadine,
is
are you
Nadine's
saying?
hero.
Okay,
and
I see
that
what you're
sucks.
saying. Yeah. They're not meeting on equal terms.
No, they are not.
Never have been.
We just silently contemplate the weight of this situation
Just
together.
the next thing's Harry Truman. I guess we just go for that. There's not a good segue I could think of.
A moment. Give me a moment.
Oh, I got it. I got it.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you could really call this a Harry situation.
You're looking at me, and you said that as if, like,
What's the next thing on our notes, Professor?
This seems like this
What's
feels
the
like
next
the
thing on the
furthest
list?
like turn away. There's the tires have screeched and we've moved on to the Harry Truman because now we get to actually realize what happened to Harry Truman.
Well, at
and a little
least
bit
this
more answers.
explanation of it.
Yes.
Which doesn't cover the whole picture of like why the actor wasn't in it and all that sort of confusion that,
No.
well, we're probably endlessly going to wonder about.
It's
But
something.
in terms of the narrative, we get an answer.
Yes, and with the narrative, we have Harry Truman, who apparently, after the events of what happened inside of Twin Peaks,
Not
and-
only with Josie, but with Cooper.
yes, actually kind of continued his own personal research, Jacoby style.
Which is interesting. Yeah, Jacoby would personally investigate Laura Palmer's mystery forever, he said. I don't know if he actually did, but he said he was going to.
He said he was going to. I believe Truman would.
Truman
To look for
actually might have
Cooper.
done that for Cooper.
Yes, and it's constantly like keeping a tab onto Cooper, but eventually a form of cancer develops within him. And after all this time, he then instates his brother to try to take over for the sheriff's station, but only because, for one, his brother was a retired sheriff, like he is someone with a fair amount of experience, but also he wants him to help clean things up for Hawk because he wants Hawk to be the sheriff, which I imagine might have somewhat of a connection because we're dealing with a situation where Harry may have felt more distracted and now during this time, like sitting down, recognizes on what he let go and wants to give Hawk the best sort of like start in that respects and wants to make up for his fault by relying on his brother. But I also regard Hawk kind of like a brother to Truman in the respect that maybe you should trust Hawk with this endeavor more so. Hawk should be the sheriff. Hawk should be the sheriff. Hawk should be the one giving the speech, using words of his own. Thanks to what he's gained from Mark Lannerman, he should be the sheriff. He should get all sorts of...
He should be emperor of the world.
Maybe one day. We'll get there probably.
We'll get there.
But everything
Sheriff
else, it just seems like there's so many points where like the latter end of the series just takes so much from Hawk, who is very reliable, very well loved, and deserves more respect.
He doesn't need to have a buffer. Just give him the sheriff title right away. He can do it.
Yeah.
We literally know he's the most capable.
Like
he can do it.
Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I'd love if like the original like Sheriff Truman was around, and I don't mind Frank Truman, but if I had to like...
I don't mind Frank Truman is the most like damning praise I've ever heard. He's okay.
The actor, I feel, did a great
job.
Robert
Forster did fine. It's just a nothing role. I'm sorry, it's not a character.
It's something that Hawk should have been in, because not only do you then sort of like streamline the character interactions thereafter, but you then don't have to worry about any sort of like extra pieces. Am I convinced if, say, for example, Cooper ends up getting a phone call, or rather, Cooper tries to call in Hawk, who is the sheriff at the time, and then Cooper is also across from the seat, that he might have some sort of instinct against that?
It would have been more interesting that way.
I think it would have been, because we
even
have
then,
investment.
Hawk, if you have to have the Dr. Hayward Skype call, why talk to a dude you barely know when he could be talking to Hawk? At least someone he's met before. I don't know.
Hawk should be sheriff.
Hawk should be sheriff. Other thing also, I just kind of realized as you're talking, is that this is also where the fiction of this book really dies down for me. Because if Tammy has evidence that Harry Truman has been continuing this investigation into Dale Cooper for the past 25 years, why are we not seeing any of it? Like, right, just think about this for a moment, right? Her job is to investigate the dossier, and that involves the disappearance of Dale Cooper. That's kind of what this became, right? She's on that task force. And you're telling me Harry Truman supposedly did 25 years of research, and we're going to bring up none of the examples. Zero findings. Not a thing. That means Harry Truman sucked so bad. Harry Truman was like, I noticed these tracks in the forest, and it could be a snowshoe rabbit, or it could be Dale Cooper. And it's clearly a photo of rabbit footprints. Otherwise, I'm like, there's got to be some evidence this guy found in 25 years.
I've discovered there are trees in the forest. In tape.
What if it was a lie? He actually wasn't searching for Dale Cooper. It was just an excuse whenever he wanted to be left alone and go in the woods or something. Yeah, I'm gonna go investigate the Cooper case, and then he just goes and like cracks open a beer and goes fishing, like just completely unrelated. I don't know. I think it doesn't make any sense the moment I just stop and think about it. Wait, if the whole point of the dossier is all these like findings and research and whatever, wouldn't Harry Truman's findings of 25 years make sense to include?
No, because we need to skip into the fact that he got cancer and his brother took over.
Yeah, we just tell us the footnotes. Don't give us anything.
It's not even, it's not
That's
even
horrible.
footnotes.
I just didn't even think about that.
Next page.
Because I was just responding to what is there. I'm not responding as much to what isn't. And it's like,
we've learned that that's important in this.
That's important. And also, we don't even know if the bookhouse still exists. I mean, you could argue that's kind of interesting to not know. But I want to point out that, like, Tammy compliments the bookhouse, says it's a nice positive form of the otherwise bad militias that are out here. I like the bookhouse. But then, like, we don't know if they still exist because I don't think that the current aged Hawk and Ed are going to be going around doing side missions all the time. So I'm going to guess that if anyone would be, it would be James, but he doesn't seem to be involved anymore. What about Joey Paulson? Is Joey Paulson the one bookhouse boy left? Maybe Bobby got inducted. We don't know. Because it doesn't say, and it's like, that's something that maybe would be fun to explore, because with regular Access Guide, Access Guide gave us a history about them that maybe we can incorporate some of that in there or something. I just think if you want to tell a story and kind of fill these things in, there are angles. Not a Robert angle in this case, but a Twin Peaks angle nonetheless.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know, it'd be kind of cool to know if the book house is still happening. I guess it doesn't matter.
Nah, it's for us to have the weight of thinking that there might be like a legacy situation. There's a whole new group, etc. Just because it is technically a coffee house from what we've discovered, but that's just a series of etceteras.
Yeah, I had a bunch of notes about Mr. C. I'm gonna kind of condense it because I don't know, his book's draining me, draining me like a negative life force, just like one could say Mr. C is.
But Mr. C's like a battery, right? So this should recharge you again.
C like a drowning ocean in which I am at the dark depths, being
C,
crushed.
C as in, yes, I'm very excited to get into this. Like, yes, in Spanish, to clarify.
Anyway, Tammy goes through like 3 different options of what Mr. C is like, and then just kind of shrugs and says, I don't know. Where it's like, she's like, oh, he might be the dweller on the threshold, all the negative, unresolved things of Dale Cooper. But then also maybe a tulpa, although maybe a tulpa's not what we thought it was, because it sounds like tulpas are made by magicians, and they're not doppelgangers. I don't know. Oh, also Bob was there, so maybe Bob possessed him. Who's to say?
I think it's the usage of the phrasing such as like Black Lodge and how Tammy ends up sort of like passing along the phrasing of
and
it.
And the dweller on the threshold makes a comeback.
Dweller on the threshold.
What a deep cut coming back.
So deep, I don't remember it.
That was, I believe, Hawk's speech. He talks about you'll meet someone called the Dweller on the Threshold, and if you don't face with perfect courage, your soul will be utterly annihilated or whatever.
Okay.
That's, I believe, when the Dweller was there,
yes.
yeah.
Regardless, it's one of those cases where, like, she kind of, like, says that for simplicity's sake, we'll call it this. I feel that's kind of the case of, like, tulpas that... or another version of, like, this creature. I think that, like, we're trying so hard to make, like, this... square become a rectangle, but
yeah,
the
she's
rectangle's
like,
already...
It's like Mark Frost wanted to explain what Mr. C is, but not solve it, so just gave like 3 explanations, 2 of which seem better than the middle one, if you ask me. And also, while doing the middle one, clarifying that a tulpa is not the same as a doppelganger, even though they're easily confused.
It's this fun sort of like 3-way dichotomy that we deal with, say, for example, Dougie, Cooper, as well as Mr. C. That, I suppose, making the differences more clear, that there is, like, still, like, that layer of mystery is fine. It still is just a lot of terminologies where I don't think that it's even clear for the characters with those terminologies, which I think can be a plus in some ways, but I don't think it's a plus in this case. I think enough mystery and having mistakes and that human error can be compelling. It's not coming off that way.
Right. And I also think that begging the question a lot, which is a lot of the ways that Tammy advances these forms of logic, it does feel a bit grasping at straws when it happens. At one point, Tammy asks, rhetorically, I guess, what if the double was looking for the most important location in this alleged system? Referring to the zone of the Black Lodge. A Grand Central Station, if you will, on the other side. So it's the fact that, like, she's just throwing on these ideas, like, what if he's looking for a Grand Central Station? And then, what if the double got there? What would he do? And then, of course, the audience is meant to wonder. So I'm going to throw that question at you, Professor. Was the double, Mr. C, looking for the most important location in the zone or Black Lodge, a sort of Grand Central Station, if you will, on the other side?
I think that for the most part, from what we get from Bob from the series, from what text that we're receiving, and by extension Mr. C, is that they're looking for something of a at the end of a great tragedy. It's something that is something so monumental of power and potentially what sadness that it can accrue that we literally saw it in the interior of a nuclear bomb, which has led to a lot of sadness for people. I mean, I think that sense of sadness, misery, wanting to try to seek that out, sure, you can call that the Grand Central Station, but I just think that it's just more so copious amounts. I think it's more the vastness more than it is the redirected any route.
Okay, because I mean, to me, the Grand Central Station most literally apply to the Mauve Zone, where there's literally places you can go from there. Like, there's like slots you can leave and enter through places, but I don't think that's as compelling as what you're saying. I just think what the most likely Grand Central Station would be that.
It may very well be, and that might be a case.
If something was to be a Grand Central Station.
If something had to be a Grand Central Station, I just can't help but think that
because he doesn't want to go to the Red Room.
We've had examples of the Red Room. He's been in the Red Room.
He doesn't want to go there.
More examples of like what that is.
Yeah, but he doesn't want to go there.
He does not want to go there. Exactly.
Yeah, I don't understand.
It's weird. That's the place where it literally has different hallways and passageways, like tunnels through Grand Central Station.
Well, I mean, it's not the same as light switches.
You're correct.
I don't know, man.
Outlets.
Let's talk about Judy. I remember when I read this the first time, I was like interested because I wanted some answers. And now I'm like undecided if I want answers or not. I think regardless of whether I want answers on Judy, I think these answers aren't very good.
It's the thing that we've mentioned in the past, where whenever you are to give answers to a mystery, it has to be as compelling as the mystery, at least like a bare minimum.
If there's one motto our podcast has kind of stood by, I think it's that.
Yeah.
And we might not always agree what that even means or how to articulate it, but in general, that has to be the case. And I think that in this case, the answers are not as good as the mystery. Maybe other answers would have been. But with regards to Judy, which seemed deliberately left open and vague in Fire Walk With Me, and in The Return. If David Lynch and Mark Frost, I guess, writing the script, wanted to communicate the things I'm about to say, they could have communicated them in The Return. And it might not have been graceful, but also there's other times in The Return where info dumps happen, where Gordon Cole just says a bunch of things, like giving a bunch of history on things.
Yes.
Like he does give the Jowday thing a little bit. If we wanted to include more of these details, we could have, but they weren't. They're instead saved for the book. And this is where, like, my general feeling of the book kind of comes through, where it's like, hey, you want answers on Judy? Let me tell you what, you can just buy this extra book we made, and you can find out. And it feels a little gross to me that you have to buy the book to get the answer to the show. I feel like sometimes that can be okay, but this is one of those cases where, like, if you're going to answer it anyway, why did you do it this way? And if you're going to answer it, is this the best answer? And I don't think it is. So, carved into the wall, apparently, all of a sudden we're finding out, never heard of this before, carved into the wall at Philip Jeffries' hotel room in Buenos Aires was the name Judy. But wait, it's spelled Joudy, Jowdy. Sounds a lot like Jowday to me. And as Tammy researched, apparently pretty easy to find out this info on the webs, Jowdy is an ancient entity in Sumerian mythology dating back to at least 3000 BC, described as a species of wandering demons that have traveled and escaped the underworld, called Utuku, feast on flesh and souls, including, would you believe it, they like to eat human suffering. Hey, Twin Peaks fans out there, you might have noticed human suffering. It kind of reminds you of something, doesn't it?
I think that this is just the point where it's literally in quotation marks. There's only like one other page and inside this book that I think like touches upon like something funny. I'll get to the funny thing, but this is like one or two instances where the Pee-wee's Playhouse situation comes in, where it's like you say the secret word and then people start yelling. Ah!
It's the level of mystery of Dora the Explorer. When you're like, I need to get something out of a carrying case. What should I open next? And the kids are screaming, backpack, open the backpack, Dora. And Dora's like, right, backpack. That's the level of mystery this is. Yes, Garmin Bozia, are you happy, Judy? Are you happy, Tammy? Are you hearing Mark Frost? Are you happy, Book? Are you happy, Dora? All I ever wanted to do was make you happy, Dora.
Muy bien!
So, very muy bien is that we find out that Judy's the female version, and the male version is called Ball, or as I like to say, Bulb. And then also you can call him
Beelzebub, which is like Beelzebub.
So very, very clearly to us, these are just names being used because if you squint your ears really hard, you can pronounce Ball like Bob and Beelzebub like Beelzebub. And having there be a male and a female one together, you're thinking of what's the male counterpoint to Judy. You're thinking it all ties. It all ties, and it seems so obvious it made my eyes roll.
Bob and Judy have to meet inside of this point of like a marriage for something absolutely horrible, catastrophic, world-ending to occur. And I'm just thinking to myself in this situation, like beforehand, I was just thinking like the mystery of having Mr. Select show off this card and so on in his pursuit. Is it that he wants to try to take control of Judy? Is he just trying to basically have a way that he takes from Judy, since like Judy is at the buffet of misery? Is Judy just the sense of misery and that's where he has to try to locate her? But no, instead, when he shows that little card of Judy and he's like, and tries to get more information of like this little heartless little formation to Judy, it's just more so him showing off like the Tinder profile of the girl that he met. He's like, can you help me? I'm trying to find her. Like a little stalker that he is. Which, yes, by all technicalities, he is. He's stalking out his Tinder profile so he can get that marriage going.
I have no problem with having clarity on some of these things because I remember disliking how in The Return, it's so unclear what Mr. C's goals are that it makes it hard for me really to feel what's happening. I can't tell what he's even after to the point where I don't even know what the plot is. Some clarity is good, but refusing to give clarity, ending with total ambiguity, and then releasing a book like 2 months later that, oh, yeah, here's the answer. And it's the most like kind of boring answer you could come up with. That's not good. Like telling me the answer after the fact and it's not really that interesting is not good.
Now, mind you, there is some good inside of here if we dig a little bit, or in my personal opinion, it is.
If we,
for the respect, if we took the legwork.
Like the woodsman, we dig through the chest and wipe the blood on our face.
Wipe the blood on our face. The big part about it is that Bob and the frog moth lady, which I'm just going to quickly say in this respect, is heavily implied in this book. Heavy 100% implied.
Basically confirmed.
Sarah Palmer.
Which again, if you wanted to do that, why wasn't her name in the credits as Sarah Palmer? But anyway.
Regardless, we have a situation where, like, Sarah Palmer has this frog moth within her, and we believe that that's where Judy is.
Right.
And that's where we're led to Judy at the end of the series.
That makes sense why Mr. C was about to try to go there before the giant redirected him instead to the Twin Peaks Sheriff Department.
Leland was a past host with Bob, and they were together, and they got married, and the biggest question that I think leads to interesting angles is, when these two get married and wed, is it because, like, the misery hasn't happened enough yet that was able to create the catalyst that was Judy, like awaken that within Judy, that it needed that sheer amount of misery that had to go? I can't, like, imagine myself personally that it was just Bob, like, knowingly having to sort of, like, feed into it, and that was his purpose. I think he might have just stumbled into it and realized he was the one who ended up creating this Judy situation, or at the very least, he may have tried but didn't know it succeeded, because otherwise, why would he go through so many loops to try to find Judy if he's been to their house before? He lived there, so instead he's taking these extra dimensional wormholes, but he knows the address.
I am terribly confused and not in a way that compels me. Maybe you're compelled by this.
I'm compelled.
I am very much not, and partly because, again, it's all beside the point. What I think's meaningful and interesting about the Palmer family and the tragedy that happened there are the human elements. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm willing, I think the Bob stuff that happened with, like, Leland being possessed, that can work. That can lead to interesting areas. But I think the moment you start getting in this, like, grand scheme of these demons over thousands of years, and you start to turn all this into sci-fi and fantasy, I really lose sight of what I thought mattered. And I think that's the great irony of Twin Peaks: The Return for me, is that for how much David Lynch and the show insist that Laura is the one, I feel we get further and further and further away from what really mattered about Laura's story, which was best realized in the diary and Fire Walk with Me. And that's the human part of it. Mm-hmm. So I could speculate forever. The language in the book says that their resulting marriage would create something far more perilous. Well, it uses the word marriage. And I'm thinking, well, Bob and Judy did get married if that's Leland and Sarah. But then what's the thing they created in their marriage? Laura? Baby. Laura? But she's the gold orb. What does that mean? And I could do that forever. And I'm at the same point thinking I could do that forever, and I'm thinking, what's at the end of that? What's at the end of that rainbow I'm going to be chasing? It's not going to be Oz. That's not going to be Oz. I just feel like it's not really interesting. Like, I'd much rather focus on the reality of the people living through it, maybe using the supernatural and metaphysical as a way to talk about trauma, as a way to talk about how unspeakable evil men do. But I think the moment that it gets into, like, Sumerian mythology, I am just tuning out. This to me was a big flop, a big no on the landing for me.
Mm-hmm. And I personally can see it. If I might talk about Tammy Preston and her accounts.
We don't talk about Tammy. I'm going to turn into like Philip Jeffries, but for our world. And I'm just going to manifest in people's rooms and say, I'm not going to talk about Tammy Preston.
Don't talk about Tammy. No. But Tammy Preston, this is where I'm getting into the structural end of things and the consistency of them and how we're, like, feeling these things out. One aspect that comes in is that Tammy Preston, for her rushedness for the project and so on, ends up leaving, and a lot of that is due to a condition where she's starting to, like, question things with Laura Palmer and so on. But the other highlight that we see inside the book, very much literally in bold. This is not quoted. Mm-hmm. This is in bold. You turn to the page, it's going to be the most clear thing in the entire book. Laura did not die. Or at the very least, Laura has not been presumed dead inside the text. What happened is that when people are addressed,
Tammy Preston noted sort of like a glazy look that they had within their eyes. And
The Twin Peaks Sheriff Department did not understand. They were confused at first.
yes, and that from what we understand now is that it was a disappearance case. There were areas where, say, for example, Leland ended up, instead of dying around that time, ended up committing suicide a year after.
This book has so many references to suicide.
It does. It genuinely does.
It seems to be the failsafe Mark Frost is using to get rid of characters.
And then we also have the mother, Sarah Palmer, where she ends her, she is very much in that sort of miserable end nonetheless. And there's various points within this area where all these lives that have been touched are not butterfly effect, but instead it seems like everything is being almost spackled, like a crack on the wall or a crack in the pavement.
Tool on Photoshop.
A smoothing tool in which everything is being filled over with new bits of information that'll contradict the old bits, but still enough that they're trying to sway in this new reality. Mm-hmm. It's not a rupture, it's not an earthquake, but instead a cover-up of a almost supernatural degree.
Which this seems to very much line up with what Jeffrey said, that, say hello to Gordon if you see him, he'll remember the official version. Mm-hmm. This seems to be the official version situation where the official version is going to be different than the maybe remembered version.
It's one of those cases where, dialogue like that, I know that David Lynch didn't read the books, but maybe there was communication about if there are books that this might be a reveal. Elsewise, there's nothing inside of the show to reveal that he would know anything and everyone else's minds would slowly be slipping away. Or if Gordon Cole even existed in that new reality Cooper went off to.
I think the fact, again, what's being omitted is often very important. The fact that we don't have a follow-up on what happened to Cooper later, he's still disappeared as of a year later, and we haven't heard anything about Carrie Page.
Yep.
Since this book didn't explain Carrie Page, I'm going to assume that wherever Dale Cooper went, he could not return from, and it is not the same world that Tammy lives in.
Yes.
Just because if it was possible to explain it, I think she would have. She tackled everything else.
We've tackled shaky foundations on things such as the return, on much areas of secret history. And I made note towards the shaky foundation is something that could lead into different avenues. And I think that this is the absolute conclusion of that avenue. Whether or not you like it, it seems that there are greater things at play, that if there needs to be anything sort of retconned, slighted, or moved in a formation, at the end of the day, these larger entities, larger than all these lives, will be able to do that.
Also, as a note, at one point, Tammy mentions that basically the My Life, My Tapes and Diane products are not to be relied on because Tulpa Diane apparently made them unreliable.
Sometimes it's not really big people that are doing the omission. Sometimes it's Tulpa Diane.
Which I think is, the more I thought about it, the more it makes sense that Frost would want to maybe identify that, because in My Life, My Tapes, it does get confusing where there's a different account versus Fire Walk With Me about Dale Cooper going to Deer Meadow. So My Life, My Tapes does have retconned elements later. But what I think is curious is that seeing Mark Frost go out of his way to basically point out to the reader, by the way, those things, take them with a grain of salt. Mm-hmm. It doesn't feel like he needed to, but I do understand maybe why he'd want to. Mm-hmm. But then in the same book that he says that, we can't even trust this book because the author seems to have troubles with it, whether you think that's Mark Frost or Tammy.
Yeah.
There's a lot of continuity issues. There's a lot of other problems going on. And so you end up in this situation where, I get it that maybe My Life, My Tapes and Diane aren't to be fully trusted, but is this book? Is this book any more reliable?
Not really.
I think it's not. So I do have a list of contradictions, errors, discrepancies, that sort of thing. It is smaller than what I had with Secret History. One, because Secret History is much longer, but then also because I wanted to narrow it down to some of the bigger ones, so that way we're not, diving into a lot of the same types of things that we've already covered in either this episode or in the previous one. The point is that it didn't stop. He's still kind of having those errors in the book. And maybe before I'd be willing to give it a little more benefit of the doubt about the different timeline possibilities. But I think in the final dossier, the kinds of things that are happening, especially because the book called out My Life, My Tapes for not being accurate and bent it over backwards to correct the story about Ernie and Vivian, I'm going to look at it with a little bit more scrutiny. So, 2 examples where the book contradicts itself. First is that Agent Tammy says that she is going to return to the matters of Bobby and Shelley Briggs later on, presumably in the same book. I'll get to that later.
Yep.
And then she doesn't. Mark Frost, when asked about this, said, and maybe he was joking, maybe he was serious, I don't have the audio of this, he said that this is because Tammy abandoned her research after discovering the changed timeline. So she just stopped. She didn't write anymore. That's why it didn't end up in the book. She planned to, but she didn't. And then the second one where it contradicts itself is that, this was maybe more black and white, the book says that Annie Blackburn was born in 1973. But later it says that Annie was in her early 20s when she moved to Twin Peaks, which would have been in 1989. That's when the show's taking place. But if she was born in 1973, that would make her 15 or 16 when she arrived in Twin Peaks. Meaning that if that was true, she'd be around the same age of a high school student, younger than Audrey, who Dale Cooper wouldn't date because she was in high school. But then he goes and dates. Obviously, that doesn't make any sense.
No.
Obviously, it doesn't work. Again, when asked about that, reportedly, Mark Frost said that, maybe in joking, this inconsistency can be attributed to an error on Tammy Preston's part. Throughout our podcast, and I'm saying this so far, so late into our podcast, but
Yes.
I do the best I can to try to find information and try to condense it and try to be reliable. And I know there are times where people fact check, and I'm glad you do. I'm glad you tell me either in YouTube comments or let us know over email so we can make corrections, or just so other people reading the comments can see those things.
Yes.
Recently, I also noticed someone correcting a video I did where I was talking about kind of an introduction to Twin Peaks. And there I said something that's kind of been debated and kind of questioned, and that was whether or not people booed at the Cannes Film Festival for Fire Walk with Me. I don't know. That's just what I was reading. This is a consistent case with Twin Peaks. So I don't know. When I give these stories with Mark Frost, without having the actual audio like in front, like in my ear, I have to go with what's been reported and what's been stated. But it sounds like, from what I'm seeing, that at least twice, Mark Frost justifies a mistake in this book by jokingly or seriously blaming Tammy.
Which, if you put him as a little bit of a author surrogate, if we are to take that sort of role, is it possible, say, for example, if we believe that this book is unfinished, if it was, we didn't have enough time, things had just had to end, and...
Right.
Yeah,
it makes you wonder what the fuller story is. What exactly is going on that really made this the way it was. I think these are both just mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
I think the timeline one with 1973 versus how old she'd be later, that's just simple mistake. And normally that's something I would expect to get caught in the editing. Like, writing a book is hard. I think that's something where it falls on the editor to really fact check that and really make sure what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not even fully blaming Mark Frost for that.
Mm-hmm.
But this is more evidence that maybe there's some issues. And along with that, there's different contradictions between Twin Peaks' other material and the final dossier. And some of these also relate to years and dates and ages.
Yes.
So, for example, the book says that Donna moved to New York in 1992 at the age of 18. But in the show, she's 18 at the end of season 2 when her parents split up in 1989. So my question is, if she was 18 in 1989, how can she still be 18 in 1992?
Very nice face cream.
Yeah, she's got a little bit of that Annie Blackburn routine. You don't age a day. You don't seem aware of reality either. In the book, Johnny Horn, if we follow the timeline, he's supposed to be in his early 40s by the time of 2017, by the time of present. But the original series, following the same timeline, he would have been in his mid-50s, based on how old Johnny is in seasons 1 and 2, if you add on 25 years, that kind of deal. Mm-hmm. So there's a difference of ages again. Maybe it's less obvious because we're not dealing with someone being a teenager or whatever, but it is still like unaccounted for at least 10 plus years of his life.
Yes.
In the book, Caroline's maiden name is Wickham. In the series, Caroline's maiden name is Powell. So this disregards the name. And this is the kind
They're
of
really
error.
close, though.
Yeah, really. There's not a single letter in common, is there? I'm looking at trying to find anything. Well, there's a W. There's a W. Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. Found it. That's a W for us.
For Wyndham. He's the common thread.
Is he?
I don't know. I look at this, and this is the kind of error that I could see people trying to justify with Secret History of Twin Peaks, saying maybe it's a timeline thing. But I think at this point, there already is a timeline thing confirmed in. It has nothing to do with last names changing. Mm-hmm. It has to do with Laura Palmer dead or not. And I don't think Laura Palmer dead or not would change Caroline's maiden name. I just don't. And the book places Vivian and Ernie Niles' wedding at least a few years before the events of the show. But if that's true, it doesn't make any sense, because when Vivian and Ernie Niles show up in Twin Peaks, the show, they're newlyweds on a honeymoon.
Yes.
It's a surprise new husband, not someone that was been with her for years. And this is the big one. This is the one that really blew my mind when I read it on the Twin Peaks Wiki. Again, huge shout out to the people doing the Twin Peaks Wiki. You guys do incredible work, like voluntarily mining these books for things like this, and I'm glad someone's keeping record.
We appreciate you.
So, the big one. Major Briggs's dossier, which was the focus of the secret history of Twin Peaks, is said to have been recovered from a storage locker in the basement of Ruth Davenport's building weeks after her body was discovered. But if it really was weeks later, that puts the time when Tammy found the dossier and it was given to her by Gordon Cole. It puts that time frame after the events of the return, because they discover Ruth Davenport's body during the return, and a few weeks later her getting it doesn't match up. And in The Secret History of Twin Peaks, Tammy said that she did not know the fate of Cooper or Briggs. She very much would know. You could try to wiggle and say, well, she doesn't know what really happened to Cooper, but she would know a whole lot more about the double than she lets on, and she would know what happened to Major Briggs. And she doesn't in The Secret History. So this element in the final dossier actively makes the previous book not make sense. While the book, again, is telling you not to take My Life, My Tapes, Diane too seriously, because those have been tampered with.
Yes.
It's just very messy. And I wonder what this book could have been if it would have had more time to develop, and maybe Mark Frost would give another year on it, and there was more editing. Maybe they hired another editor or two, and they maybe consulted someone like John Thorne or someone in the fan community who's actively involved in Twin Peaks to help with some of the editing or checking on it, maybe just a little bit here, pay them something. And maybe include more examples of other characters writing, like have something with Truman with his research. Have some more of these characters writing from their voices, like Annie. Maybe you also then split the narrative so that Albert's doing some of this as well, so you get multiple voices coming in. Really flesh out this book so it's like twice as long and packed with stuff.
It is something that I think needed more time, to be created, or something had to happen to make up for the fact that it literally came out very shortly after the end of The Return. And the fact that it comes out shortly after, I understand from a business perspective, but it just genuinely doesn't feel like it made it, or at the very least, like something happened to the point that I don't feel this is complete.
Now, by the time this episode of our podcast airs, we will probably already have recorded the final episode of our podcast and really done everything with the curtain call. I would still like, with that being said, if you are a fan of this book, if you like the final dossier, I would love to hear why. Not to challenge you, but to genuinely understand the perspective of a fan. Because normally the professor and I have back and forths. Typically, if I don't like something like in The Return, the professor balances me out. This is one of those cases where we're both kind of negative on it.
Yeah.
There's no guarantee we'd be able to feature you in an episode, because like I said, there won't be time. But I would still love to hear from you. Did you like the final dossier? What about it really you thought grabbed you? If you could leave that in a YouTube comment on this upload, or also send it to our Gmail at snakeeyedreams@gmail.com, or tweet at us, snakeeyedreams1, that's the numeral 1, as in I've got one wonderful and strange question of the week for you, Professor. The last wonderful and strange question of the week I have for you before we do the curtain call.
Yay! So there's no more in the curtain call?
I won't spoil that.
Yeah.
Actually, we kind of already have.
We kind of did.
Yeah, the listeners are going to get I'm not going to do any.
No need to.
This is my last one.
This is your last one.
Okay, I think
it's
a pretty suitably big one. Mm-hmm. If this question goes badly, it's on you. My question's flawless.
Okay. Thank you.
Let's say season 4 of Twin Peaks got announced tomorrow. They announced it. Twin Peaks season 4. That's going to happen. What would you say would be the best things they could include in that announcement, or as the information comes out, that would make you either more interested in the project, have faith in it, or make it more promising? What would be the things that'd be like, okay, I'm interested? What would bring your hopes in?
This is a weird question, mostly for the respects that I don't genuinely get too excited for, like, the specifics on things, except for very, very, very rare instances. So the hypothetical of what can draw me in, if you're telling me that there's going to be another Twin Peaks item, or like there's going to be more Twin Peaks stuff that's officially released, I'm probably already sold on checking it out. The only thing that they could ever do is throw things so far under the bus and make it seem far worse. But even then, I'd like to still give it a try and dip my toe into. It's more so what would be absent from there that might kind of potentially deter me, or it might fascinate me. If they went through a whole new cast, well, they did a little bit of that initially in, like, The Return as opposed to Twin Peaks. But it also makes sense for how much time has passed. Where is David Lynch inside of his filmography? Has he released anything since then, or is he just jumping straight back into The Return? It's something which I do think that there needs to be a little bit more distance on, but personally I also recognize time waits for no one, and David Lynch won't be here forever.
Because we got announced tomorrow, David Lynch has not made a feature film or other series since. There were talks, and maybe there's still talks about him having a project, but that seems to be very unclear at current time of recording what's going on with his project.
If David Lynch, his last work was a Return, I think that's great, mostly because of situations that we've seen inside the special features, and I only have the special features to guide me, but it seems like he had a fantastic time working with all these people, familiar and new faces. I think that if you had to go out on that as your last bit of legacy, I think that he did something that he is very happy and proud of. If something came up after that, I hope that he's able to rekindle either that joy or find some new joy from it. But at this point, I'm kind of looking forward to letting other people handle the reins on Twin Peaks. I'm looking forward to the small little fan projects that I'm able to see on my own time. And though I can't promise, listener, that you're going to hear me be vocal on towards those ends, I still nonetheless am excited to see what the community brings together as fan works more than I am ever interested in on, say, for example, new season pops up and Gordon Cole has another donut.
For me, I wrote a very, very short list. Shorter. I would like Twin Peaks Season 4 to be shorter than 18 hours. I think that was part of the problem for me.
Just slapped on his like, and Twin Peaks returns with shorter episodes.
I want probably less episodes, but shorter episodes also would work. I would want more variety of writers and directors, kind of like what you're saying. And would be one idea you could do with that'd be kind of cool, would be maybe to make it more of a either anthology series or something where like each episode is written by a different writer and directed by a different director.
Okay.
So what I'm thinking of, I haven't watched it, but I know last year Guillermo del Toro had that like horror series anthology where each episode was directed by a different like horror movie director. We know that Twin Peaks has been very influential to other creators in the field. Maybe try to reach out and see if, like, the guy who made Lost could make an episode of Twin Peaks. You know what I'm saying? I think it'd be interesting to see other people's takes on Twin Peaks, and I'd be willing to say go full experimental. If you want to have someone do an animated episode, just do it.
And if you want to hear Kalil talking about other people's takes on Twin Peaks, I believe Kalil did a video on a published work that shows different takes on Twin Peaks.
Which one?
That one.
What are you talking about?
What's the name of it? It's not Everything in Heaven is Fine. Which one was the David Lynch one?
That was Everything.
Oh.
That's on Twin Peaks. That's on David Lynch, though.
Oh, yes, it's a David. Oh, sorry. Let me correct that. David Lynch. It was David Lynch and the retrospective. If you want someone who really falls into the line of like talking about the David Lynch stuff, Kalil talks about a book about other people trying David Lynch stuff.
In Heaven, Everything is Fine?
In Heaven, Everything is Fine. Go see that. I'm plugging you in.
I'm plugging the book in.
Good.
I think we should pull the plug on our series right now. Oh, well, I mean, after the curtain call.
After the curtain call, it's about waiting. He's going to appear inside the forest and disappear.
I don't think season 4 is going to happen. But if I eat these words and I'm wrong, I just hope it gives us something new. And it gives us something fun. Yeah, fun and new are my two main requirements.
Fun and new, the two requirements from you. You have it plastered right onto the wall. If the flies catch onto the tape, they catch on.
If you had to summarize what you'd want in 2 words, would they be fun and new or would they be different?
Whatever makes the boat float.
That's not 2 words.
It's
I mean, float boat is 2 words.
I just put the letters together without the spacing, like cheating a little password situation. You have only so many characters. I'm cheating.
I don't want the boat to float. I want to plan with Josie Packard to blow that boat up. And this time, to quote the legendary character from The Dark Knight Rises, Bane, to blow it up with no survivors.
When did he become a colonel?
With no survivors. I don't know, during the Civil War?
The Bane in the Civil War?
Oh, Ben.